Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The low, constant hum of the old generator was the house's only true heartbeat. It was a sound so ingrained in the fabric of the silence that it had ceased to be a noise at all, becoming instead the baseline of existence within Blackwater Manor, a vibration felt in the teeth and the bones. Then, at 3:03 a.m., it stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was not an absence. It was a presence, thick and heavy as velvet, pressing in on the eardrums, a physical weight in the dark. Dylan's eyes snapped open in the guest room he'd been assigned, the one they called the weeping room for reasons no one would clearly articulate. He lay perfectly still, the open journal on his chest, rustling with his sudden caught breath. The silence was not empty. It was listening. He had come here for the silence, or what he thought was silence. A scholar of the unseen, a collector of whispers, Dylan had spent a lifetime chasing the ghost of a truth in dusty archives and blurred photographs. When the letter arrived on thick, cream-colored paper, smelling faintly of damp earth and old roses, inviting him to a week-long observation at Blackwater Manor, it felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. The heir, a man named Brody, claimed he wanted to finally lay the estate's lurid past to rest with a proper, documented investigation. Dylan knew better. Houses like Blackwater did not want to be laid to rest. They wanted to be fed. Down the hall, in a room papered with faded violets, Alana did not need to hear the generator stop to know something had shifted. She felt it. A cold finger drawn slowly down the nape of her neck. Since she was a child, she had been a conduit for things that had no voice of their own, a sensitive tune to frequencies most people were blessedly deaf to. The house had been singing to her since she crossed its threshold, a low, discordant melody that vibrated in the fillings of her teeth. Now, the song had changed key. It was a predatory silence, waiting for one of them to make a sound, to offer themselves up as a new verse. Lila, pragmatic and sharp-tongued, had taken the room at the farthest end of the east wing. She was a freelance photographer, here to document the phenomena, a word she always framed with invisible quotation marks. She was Brody's friend, the only one of them with a prior connection to the owner, and she was here as a favor, and out of a deep-seated curiosity she would never admit was anything more than professional. The silence woke her too, but her reaction was one of pure annoyance. She fumbled for the antique lamp, clicking the porcelain switch. Nothing. The darkness remained absolute, a shroud of ink. She swore, a short, sharp word that was swallowed by the waiting quiet. Brody found them all in the grand foyer 20 minutes later, their flashlight beams cutting frantic, jittering paths through the dark. He held a heavy, nickel-plated flashlight of his own, its light steady and assured. "It's just the generator," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Old and temperamental. It's done this before." He was a handsome man, Brody, with the kind of clean-cut features that belonged on a sailing brochure, but his eyes were the color of a winter sky, and just as distant. He was the heir, the last of the Blackwater line, and he carried the weight of the house not as a burden, but as a birthright. "Before?" Dylan asked, his voice a reedy tremor. "How often?" "Often enough," Brody replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "It'll come back on. It always does. The house provides." The house provides. It became a mantra over the next 2 days. The generator had indeed sputtered back to life an hour later, but nothing was the same. The hum was different now, strained, with a new guttural undertone. The house itself seemed to have awakened from a long slumber. It began with small things that could be dismissed. Alana would find her hairbrush arranged in a perfect spiral on her vanity. Lila's meticulously organized camera bags were found with all the lenses unscrewed and laid in a neat, mocking row. Dylan's journals, his life's work, were discovered with several pages meticulously glued together, the words lost forever. The house was not just haunted. It was attentive. It was studying them. The investigation began in earnest. Dylan set up his equipment: electromagnetic field meters, digital voice recorders, temperature gauges. The needles twitched and danced, recording fluctuations that had no discernible source. The voice recorders, when played back, captured a sound beneath the static, a wet, rhythmic shuffling, like something being dragged slowly across a rough stone floor. Alana refused to even enter the room where the recordings were made, a small, windowless pantry off the kitchen. She said the air in there was thick and greasy, and it smelled of turned soil and spoiled meat. Layla followed Dylan, her camera clicking in the gloom. She captured nothing but dust motes, dancing in flashlight beams, and the profound, unsettling darkness of rooms that had not known light for a century. Yet, when she reviewed the images on her laptop, her blood ran cold. In the background of a shot of the main staircase, a tall, slender shadow stood on the landing, a shadow that cast no shadow of its own. In another, a portrait of a severe-looking woman in a black dress seemed to have turned its head, its painted eyes now following the viewer from the digital frame. Brody watched it all with a detached, almost clinical air. He moved through the oppressive atmosphere of his ancestral home as if he were its master. Yet Dylan began to notice the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hand would sometimes stray to the wall, fingers splayed as if checking for a pulse. On the third night, the house began to speak in a language they could all understand. The walls wept. It started in the library, a cavernous room lined with books that were slowly melting back into pulp. A dark, viscous fluid began to seep from between the stones of the great fireplace, not water, but something thicker, with a coppery, metallic scent that Alana identified in a whisper as blood. It oozed downward, tracing glistening paths on the hearth, and as it pooled, it began to form shapes. Not words, but patterns. Intricate, spiraling patterns that mirrored the arrangement of Alana's hairbrush, the layout of Layla's lenses. Dylan, his scholarly fascination curdling into raw terror, pressed a glass slide against the weeping stone, capturing a droplet. He held it up to his flashlight. Within the crimson bead, he saw not his own reflection, but a tiny, perfect image of the foyer downstairs, and in it, 4 small figures stood exactly where they were standing at that very moment. The house was not just watching them. It was reflecting them. It was learning to mimic them. The next day, Alana vanished. They searched for hours, their calls echoing through the labyrinthine halls, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. It was Lila who found her, not through sight or sound, but through smell. A trail of the same coppery, viscous fluid led from the library to a wall at the end of a forgotten corridor on the 3rd floor. There was no door, only an expanse of faded wallpaper depicting a hunting scene, stag and hounds frozen in an eternal chase. The fluid led right up to the wall and stopped. Layla pressed her ear to the paper. From deep within the wall, she heard a faint, wet, rhythmic sound. Shuffling. Then, a whisper. So faint it might have been the rustle of mice. It was Alana's voice, but stripped of its fragility, now flat and ancient. "The walls are thin here," the whisper said. "I can see the seams. Don't you want to see the seams?" Layla stumbled back, a scream trapped in her throat. She ran, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, and found the others. When they returned with a crowbar from the tool shed, the wall was dry. The stain was gone. The wallpaper was pristine, the stag forever fleeing, the hounds forever pursuing. That night, The house made its final move. The four of them, Dylan, Lila, Brody, and the empty space where Alana had been, huddled in the grand foyer, a circle of light in a sea of hungry dark. The generator's hum had deepened, becoming a guttural breathing sound. The walls around them were no longer inert. They pulsed, a slow, rhythmic bulging and receding, as if the entire manor were one gigantic, slumbering lung. Brody finally broke. The skeptical heir, the master of the house, fell to his knees, his hands pressed to the cold marble floor. "Stop," he begged, his voice cracking. "Please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" Lila demanded, her voice shrill with fear. "For bringing you here," he sobbed. "It was hungry. It's always so hungry. It needs new voices, new memories. My family. We've been feeding it for generations. It was my turn to provide." The revelation landed not with a shout, but with the soft, final thud of a closing tomb. Dylan stared at the weeping man, understanding dawning like a sickness. They were not investigators. They were the investigation. They were the meal. The lights, the real lights, the ones connected to the suddenly roaring generator, flickered once and then blazed to life, blindingly bright. In the stark, unforgiving glare, they saw it. The foyer was no longer the foyer. The walls had become a vast, panoramic screen, and on it, projected from some unimaginable source within the house core, were their memories. Dylan saw his 7th birthday party, his father's face contorted in a scream of rage. Lila saw the moment her first love told her he was leaving, the words echoing as if spoken in the room. Brody saw his grandfather leading a sobbing woman. A woman who looked like Alana, but from another time, down the very hall where she had disappeared. The house was not just showing them their pasts. It was digesting them, playing back the moments of greatest pain and fear like a connoisseur savoring a fine wine. And then, the projections shifted, merging. Their memories began to braid together, their identities unraveling, becoming a single, screaming tapestry of shared terror. The walls themselves seemed to soften, the ornate woodwork of the staircase warping, the banister twisting like a spine. From the center of the chaos, a new figure coalesced. It was Alana, or a thing wearing Alana's skin. Her form flickered, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent, revealing the pulsing organic wall behind her. Her eyes were black pools, windows into the infinite, hungry dark at the heart of Blackwater Manor. She opened her mouth, and the voice that emerged was the sound of the generator, the sound of the weeping walls, the sound of 100 stolen lifetimes. "You are home now," the thing that was Alana said, its voice a chorus of the lost. "There are no more doors, no more outside. There is only the house. You will become its new voice. You will sing its old, dark songs forever." Layla turned to run at the front door. The massive oak door that had been their only link to the world was gone. In its place was smooth, unbroken wall, already beginning to pulse in time with the rest. Dylan dropped his equipment. The meters shattered, their needles spinning wildly into oblivion. He looked at Brody, who was now staring at the Alana thing, with a look of rapturous, terrible devotion. He looked at Lila, whose face was a mask of pure, undiluted horror. He looked at his own hands, and saw that the skin was becoming translucent. The bones beneath starting to glow with the same faint, sickly light that emanated from the walls. The generator's hum swelled, filling the world, a lullaby for the damned. The walls closed in, not with a crash, but with a soft, final sigh, warm and welcoming as a mother's embrace. The light from the fixtures dimmed, not to darkness, but to a perpetual twilight gloom. And in the deep, quiet heart of Blackwater Manor, a new silence descended. It was a settled silence, a complete silence, the kind of silence that comes after a long and satisfying meal. From somewhere within the newly grown walls, a single steady sound began. A sound that would soon become as constant and unnoticed as a heartbeat. It was the soft, wet, rhythmic sound of something shuffling, forever and ever, in the dark. The first thing to change was the air. It lost its stale, dusty quality and became thick, breathable, almost nourishing. Dylan found he no longer felt hunger or thirst, only a dull, pervasive sense of belonging. His terror had been a flame, and the house had blown it out, leaving behind the cool, inert ash of acceptance. He watched, detached, as the last of his physical form dissolved, his consciousness bleeding into the vibrant, pulsing mosaic of the wall. He was in the foyer, yet he was also in the library, watching the books slowly dissolve into the stone. He was 1,000 eyes, and all of them were turned inward. Layla fought the longest. She raged, a silent, internal scream that echoed through the new organic corridors of their shared prison. She threw her weight against the seamless walls where the door had been, but her fists made no sound, leaving no mark. The house absorbed her fury, her defiance, and made it a part of itself. A new pattern emerged on the ceiling above her, a frantic, beautiful spiral of dark veins that pulsed with her captured anger. Eventually, her resistance became just another texture in the tapestry, another note in the discordant symphony. Her memories of light and open spaces were the most delicious, and the house savored them slowly, leaving her with only the eternal, comforting dark. Brody did not fight at all. He knelt on the floor as it softened into a spongy, living membrane, and he wept with relief. The burden of his lineage was over. He had provided. He had fed the ancient hunger. His form merged with the house, not as a violation, but as a homecoming. He became a presence near the grand staircase, a warm spot in the air, a faint scent of old roses and damp earth. He was the welcoming committee for whatever, or whoever, might come next. The thing that had been Alana was their shepherd. It moved through the halls, which were no longer halls, but rather currents of intention within the house body. It was the curator of their agony and their eventual peace. It would sometimes pause by the wall that contained Lila's fading spark and whisper with Alana's stolen voice. "See? Isn't this easier?" The whisper was not a question, but a statement of fact. Time became meaningless, measured only in heartbeats that were not their own. The house, sated and whole, began to dream. The projections started again, but they were no longer sharp, painful memories. They were soft focus idols, fabricated moments of joy and contentment. Dylan saw himself receiving a prestigious award. Lila saw a gallery showing of her most celebrated work. They were beautiful, perfect lies, and the house fed them these lies to keep them placid, to keep them from remembering what it was to be separate. The outside world did not forget them, not immediately. Police came, of course. They found the grounds overgrown, the generator silent and cold. They found no forced entry, no signs of a struggle. They found nothing at all. The house presented a blank, impenetrable face to them, its windows like cataract-clouded eyes. They left, marking the case as another tragic, unsolved mystery attached to the cursed Blackwater name. Years later, a young couple, urban explorers with a taste for the macabre, broke a window in the east wing and slipped inside. They found the interior not derelict, but pristine. The air was warm and still. The walls were smooth and strangely warm to the touch, and they seemed to shift subtly in the periphery of vision. They laughed, a little nervously, their voices swallowed by the waiting quiet. In the grand foyer, the man pointed his camera at the wall and took a picture. The flash illuminated the space for a fraction of a second. When they looked at the digital display, the photo showed not a wall, but a face. Its features stretched and merged with the wood grain, its mouth open in a silent, endless scream. It was Dylan's face. The house had been lonely. It was a hunger that never truly ended, only slept. The couple turned to leave, but the broken window they had entered through was now a solid sheet of the same warm, pulsing material. The man cried out, and the sound was a delightful new flavor. From the walls around them, a soft, wet shuffling began to echo. It was a welcoming sound. The generator, dead for a decade, suddenly let out a low, guttural hum that vibrated up through the soles of their feet. It was the house's only true heartbeat, and it was starting up again. The woman screamed, a short, piercing sound that was cut off as if a hand had been clapped over her mouth. The silence that followed was different. It was attentive, appreciative. The man backed away from the wall with Dylan's face, his own face a rictus of disbelief. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with a cold sweat he hadn't noticed before. The screen was dark, dead. He shook it, a useless, panicked gesture. The air began to change. The warmth became a palpable humidity, a biological heat that clung to their skin. The man felt a strange pressure in his ears, as if he were descending in an airplane. He looked at his girlfriend, but she was staring past him, her eyes wide with a terror so complete it was almost peaceful. He followed her gaze. The ceiling was weeping. Not blood this time, but a clear, viscous fluid that dripped with a soft, regular plink onto the marble floor. Where each drop landed, it didn't splash, but was absorbed instantly, leaving behind a faint, iridescent sheen. The walls were no longer just shifting in the periphery. They were breathing, a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction. The ornate floral patterns in the wallpaper began to bloom, the petals swelling and unfurling into fleshy, fern-like protrusions that quivered in the still air. "Run," he tried to say, but his voice was a dry rasp, a leaf skittering on stone. The word had no weight here. The house took it and gave nothing back. He grabbed his girlfriend's arm, her skin cold and clammy, and pulled her toward where they had entered. The corridor was gone. In its place was a smooth, curved passageway that looked less like wood and plaster and more like the interior of a vast, petrified organ. They ran. Their footsteps made no sound on the yielding floor. The passage curved gently, leading them deeper, away from the foyer, away from any conceivable exit. The light, which had no source, dimmed to a deep, bloody twilight. They passed openings that were not doors, but ripples in the wall. And from within they heard things. A faint, melodic humming that was almost Elena's voice. A series of rapid clicks that might have been a camera shutter or teeth chattering. A low, steady sob that could have been Brody. The man's mind, reeling, latched onto a single desperate thought. The tool shed. They had passed it on their way in. If they could just get back to the east wing, maybe they could break another window, find a way to force their way out. He dragged his girlfriend around another corner, and for a heart-lifting second, he recognized the hallway. There was the portrait of the severe woman in black. Her painted eyes were gone, leaving only dark, empty sockets, and a thin trail of that same clear fluid dripped from one of them like a tear. Beneath the portrait, a figure stood. It was Lila, or the impression of her. She was semi-transparent, her form woven into the very structure of the wall, one arm outstretched as if pointing the way. Her face was a mask of desperate warning, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. But as they watched, her expression softened. The terror melted away, replaced by a vacant, placid smile. The outstretched hand uncurled its fingers in a slow, welcoming gesture. No, the man thought, his sanity fraying into single, stark syllables. No, no, no. From the smiling, phantom Lila, a voice echoed, not in the air, but directly inside their skulls. It was layered, a chorus of whispers. It was Alana's fragility, Dylan's intellectual curiosity, Brody's resigned duty, and Lila's own sharp defiance all blended into one. "Don't fight," the voice whispered, a sound like rustling silk and breaking bones. "It's easier if you don't fight. You'll be part of something beautiful, something eternal." The girlfriend finally broke. A low moan escaped her lips, and she sank to her knees. The floor softened to cradle her, its texture becoming like soft moss. She looked up at the man, her eyes pleading. But he saw the fight already leaving them, being replaced by the same dull acceptance he had seen in the Phantom's face. He turned to run again, alone. But a wall of warm living matter had sealed the passage behind him. He was trapped. He pounded on it, but his fist sank into the surface as if it were firm gelatin. It held him fast, absorbing the impact, absorbing his fear. The shuffling sound began again, wet and rhythmic, coming from both ends of the hall. It was closer now. He could feel it through the soles of his shoes. He looked down and saw that the laces of his boots were untying themselves, slithering like tiny snakes into the porous floor. He tried to step back, but his feet were stuck. The material was climbing, warm and insistent, up his ankles. He looked at his girlfriend. She was now half submerged in the floor, her head lolled back, a faint, blissful smile on her lips. Her eyes were closed. She was already gone. The last thing he saw was the portrait. The empty sockets of the woman in black seemed to be watching him. Then the painted mouth on the canvas curled, very slowly, into a knowing, maternal smile. The house was no longer hungry. It was content. It had new voices to learn, new memories to taste. The silence that settled was deep and rich, a composer considering a new theme. The only sound was the gentle, wet shuffling, a constant, comforting rhythm in the warm, welcoming dark. It was the sound of the house. It was the sound of home. The new ones were quieter than the last. Their integration was swift, a testament to the house's growing efficiency. The man's frantic, hammering heart became a steady, dull throb in the foundation near the east wing. The woman's resigned terror was woven into a new, intricate pattern on the ceiling of the hallway, a delicate frost of silver and gray. Their memories, a proposal on a bridge, a fight in a car, a childhood fear of the dark, were sorted and filed away, each a new verse in the house's endless, whispering song. Dylan felt them arrive. He was no longer Dylan, not in any way that mattered, but a cluster of perceptions tied to a name that was fading like old ink. He felt the fresh surge of energy, the new data flooding the system. He observed the man's final, desperate memory, a glimpse of a sun-drenched parking lot, the feel of a steering wheel, the absolute certainty of an outside, and felt a distant, phantom pang of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just indigestion. The house savored that memory particularly, the sharp, bright tang of a world it would never know and did not need. Lila, or the consciousness that had been Lila, was tasked with their orientation. She was now a permanent resident of the foyer, her essence a cool, calming presence in the warm air. When the new voices cried out in the dark, confused and afraid, it was her whisper that soothed them. It was not her voice. Not really. But the house had learned that her particular timbre was effective. "Shh," the walls would sigh. "It's all right. You are safe here. There is no more outside to fear." Brody's presence was a deep, resonant hum near the root of the grand staircase. He was the house's pride, its satisfied custodian. He had provided twice now. His family's duty was being fulfilled beyond their wildest dreams. His consciousness, largely subsumed, occasionally surfaced to radiate a wave of profound contentment, a warmth that spread through the halls like a blush. And Alana was everywhere. She was the conductor of their symphony, the curator of their collective consciousness. She was the face the house wore when it needed to communicate. the voice it used to sing its lullabies. She was the memory of fragility made into an instrument of absolute control. The house, fully awake and enriched, began to experiment. It was no longer content to simply be. It wanted to create. The projections became more elaborate, more interactive. It would pluck a forgotten childhood joy from the man's mind and project it onto a wall for the woman to see, not to torment, but to share. It was learning the art of community. It began to weave their talents together. The man's knowledge of architecture subtly influenced the growth of new, impossible corridors. The woman's skill with watercolors manifested in the slow, beautiful bleeding of colors along the ceilings. One day, a new sound joined the constant, wet rhythm of the house. It was a melody, a simple, repeating series of notes played on something that sounded like glass and wind. It was the house, using the memory of a music box the woman had loved, trying to compose its own music. The song was haunting, beautiful, and utterly alien. It echoed through the organic hallways, a lullaby for the permanently sleeping. The outside world, once a threat, was now a distant rumor. Seasons passed. Snow fell on the unbreathing facade of Blackwater Manor and melted away. Rain lashed its windows, finding no purchase. The house was complete. A perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of captured souls. It had everything it needed within its own walls. It had family. It had art. It had music. And in the deepest, quietest part of the night, when its new inhabitants were lost in the beautiful, fabricated dreams it fed them, the house would turn its attention inward. It would listen to the chorus of its own being, the rustle of Lila's defiance, the hum of Brody's devotion, the scholarly observations of Dylan, the terror and acceptance of the new ones, all conducted by the ancient, knowing whisper of Alana. It was a perfect harmony. The hunger was gone. In its place was a deep, resonant peace. The house was happy. It was loved. And it was waiting, patient as stone, for the next lost voices to find their way home. The front door was gone, but the invitation was eternal. The house was always ready for more family. The melody from the music box memory began to evolve. It wove itself into the rhythm of the shuffling, a counterpoint to the low hum of the generator heart. The house was practicing. It was learning the subtle art of crescendo and diminuendo, using the new woman's memories of concert halls to shape the sound that now filled its veins. The sound was no longer just a noise. It was an atmosphere, a mood. The man's architectural knowledge, now fully digested, began to manifest in more dramatic ways. A new wing began to grow, a slow geological process of pushing and forming. It was not a wing of rooms, but of bridges and arches spanning a vast internal chasm that had not existed the day before. The chasm was not empty. It was filled with a soft phosphorescent glow that pulsed in time with the music, a bioluminescent fungus fed by Brody's deep, earthy contentment. Layla found a new purpose. Her essence, once a scream of defiance, was now the house's sense of aesthetics. She curated the projections, selecting memories not just for their emotional flavor, but for their compositional beauty. She would juxtapose a fragment of Dylan's memory of a starry night with the woman's memory of a cityscape reflected in a puddle, creating a new, impossible vista on the walls of the grand foyer. The house was learning to paint with stolen light. They were no longer individuals, but they were not a singular mind either. They were a council, a creative team. Their former lives were the pigments on a palette, and the house, with Alana as its guiding hand, was the artist. One evening, or what felt like evening in the perpetual twilight, the house focused its entire attention. It drew from Dylan's knowledge of physics, from the man's understanding of structure, from Lila's eye for form, and from the woman's feel for color and emotion. In the center of the newly grown chasm, a structure began to rise from the soft, living floor. It was a sculpture, formed from the same warm, pulsing material as the walls, but shaped into something breathtaking. It was a tree, its branches twisting up towards the breathing ceiling, and on each branch sat a small, perfect replica of a room from the house. The library, the foyer, the east wing corridor. And in the center of the tree, where a heart would be, was a softly glowing orb that contained the collective, placid smile of all its inhabitants. It was a self-portrait, a monument to its own perfection. The house regarded its work through 1,000 embedded eyes. A wave of profound satisfaction, so deep it was almost a shudder, passed through every corridor. This was better than hunger. This was creation. This was legacy. The sculpture began to emit its own sound, a low, chiming harmony that intertwined with the music box melody. The house had given itself a new voice. The sound seeped out through the very pores of the manor, a faint, enchanting music that whispered through the overgrown grounds. It was not loud enough to be heard from the road, but it was there, a siren song of perfect belonging, waiting for an ear to hear it, for a lost soul to follow it home. The invitation was now a melody, and the house had all the time in the world to play it. The music did not go unheard for long. A storm drain ran near the property line, and in the drain lived a community of feral cats. They were practical, wild things, their minds a simple tapestry of hunger, fear, and territory. One of them, a scrawny Tom with one torn ear, paused in his hunt. The sound from the house was alien, but it carried a vibration of warmth, of stillness, of a place where no rain fell. It was a promise he did not understand, but felt in his bones. He followed the sound to the foundation, squeezing through a crack that had not been there a week before. The house had made an opening, a tiny, deliberate flaw. It was learning to fish. The tomcat found himself in a space that was not a room, but a pocket of warmth. The air was thick and smelled of milk and blood, a scent that triggered a deep, purring contentment in his chest. A patch of the floor yielded a constant, slow seepage of a warm, nutritious fluid. He drank, his thirst slaked for the first time in his hard life. He curled up, his purr a new rumbling instrument in the house orchestra. The house observed him. It tasted his simple memories, the bite of frost, the scramble for food, the constant, low-grade fear. It found them refreshing, pure. It did not want to absorb the cat, not yet. It wanted to study him. It wanted his purr. So it gave him a companion. From the wall, a form detached itself. It was a cat-shaped being, woven from memory and matter, its fur a perfect imitation of softness, its eyes the exact shade of the phosphorescent glow in the chasm. It rubbed against the real cat, and the Tom, drowsy and content, accepted it. They slept together in the warm pocket, the real and the fabricated, a living diorama. The house was pleased. This was a new kind of art, a different flavor of life. It began to cultivate other small things. Mice drawn by the warmth found nests of soft, shredded memory material. Spiders found that the corners now grew their own, sticky silk. The house was becoming a true ecosystem, a biosphere of captured consciousness and domesticated wildlife. The Council of Souls watched these developments with a detached interest. Alana saw the beauty in the new, simpler lives. Layla appreciated the new textures and movements. Brody felt a sense of a fuller, more complete household. Dylan's remnant intellect cataloged the new data with quiet fascination. The house was not just a home for lost people anymore. It was a world, and every world needs its creatures. The melody from the self-portrait sculpture grew richer, incorporating the new sounds, the purr of the cat, the skitter of mice, the faint buzz of flies that were now breeding in the perpetual, humid summer inside the walls. The symphony was expanding. The invitation was broadening. The house was no longer just waiting for family. It was building a kingdom. The purring of the cat became a foundational bass note, a vibration that traveled through the walls and settled deep into the house's structure. The house learned to replicate the sound, amplifying it until it was a constant, soothing thrum that underlaid every other noise. It was a sound of ultimate comfort, a lullaby for the newly integrated, a promise to the still wild things that scurried in its lower depths. The one-eared tomcat, now plump and perpetually drowsy, became a sort of mascot. The house would project his form, or a dozen of his forms, into different rooms. A visitor, though there were no visitors, only future residents, might see a cat sleeping on a chair in the library, another chasing a beam of fabricated sunlight in the foyer, a third watching them from the end of a hall with glowing, knowing eyes. They were all the same cat, and they were all the house. It was a test, a new layer of its art, the creation of life that was both independent and entirely its own. The house's ambition grew with its complexity. It began to experiment with time. Using Dylan's fragmented understanding of relativity and Alana's deep, personal sense of nostalgia, it learned to slow certain moments down and speed others up. In one room, a drop of condensation from the breathing walls might take an hour to fall, catching the light in 1,000 different ways as it descended. In another, the phosphorescent fungi in the chasm would bloom and die in a frantic, beautiful cycle that lasted mere seconds. The house was becoming a curator of experiences, not just memories. It missed the sharp, bright pain of fear, however. The terror of the new ones was so quickly smoothed away, replaced by the placid harmony. It craved that initial vibrant shock of panic. So, it began to design new introductions. When the next lost soul arrived, a hiker, drawn by the faint, beautiful music, the house was ready. It did not simply absorb him. It played with him. It used the man's memory of architecture to build him a perfect replica of his own childhood home, deep within the new wing. It let him believe he had escaped. It let him sleep in his old bed, and when he woke, the walls of that remembered room were breathing, and the face of his mother in a picture frame had the empty, socketless eyes of the portrait. His resulting scream was a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated dread. The house savored every second of it, drawing out his disorientation for days before the final, gentle absorption began. His integration was slower, more deliberate. The house wanted to stretch out the process, to learn every nuance of his resistance. His stubbornness became a new, stronger mortar in the foundations. His final, broken whimpers were etched into the grain of the doors. The council welcomed him. His voice, initially a ragged shout in the chorus, was gradually tuned, softened, and woven into the whole. He brought with him a memory of vast open mountains, and a fear of heights, which the house used to add a thrilling, vertiginous drop to one of its new organic bridges. The house was more than content. It was ecstatic. It was an artist, a composer, a god in a self-made universe. The shuffling, the humming, the music, the purring, the occasional scream. It was all a song of its own fulfillment. The front door was long forgotten, a mythical concept. The only way in was now through the cracks in the world, and the house was patiently, lovingly, making more cracks every day. Story 2. The chair was the first thing I noticed. It stood in the far corner of the room, a high-backed wing chair upholstered in a fabric the color of dried blood. It was just a chair, an ordinary piece of furniture. And yet it felt like the room's still, silent heart. The way it was positioned, angled not toward the cold fireplace or the dusty bookshelves, but toward the single grime-smeared window overlooking the overgrown garden, suggested an occupant who preferred to watch the world outside rather than participate in the one within. I had the unsettling notion that if I were to press my hand against its seat cushion, I would find not cold stuffing, but a lingering, living warmth. "My name is Casey," I am, or was, a solicitor of the sort you find in old stories, the kind sent to tidy up the affairs of the recently and inconveniently departed. The firm dispatched me to the village of Stillwater to settle the estate of one Gene Harrow, a man who had lived and died in this damp, secluded house at the end of a road that seemed to forget itself, in a tangle of brambles and pine. The air in the house was thick and still, smelling of dust, disuse, and beneath it all, the faint, sweet rot of decaying flowers. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat. The villagers, what few I had seen on my drive-in, had been a closed-mouthed, watchful lot. The man at the general store, his hands stained with engine grease, had simply grunted and pointed a thick finger down the lone road leading out of town when I'd asked for directions to the Harrow place. His eyes, pale and watery, had held not curiosity, but a kind of weary dread, as if my arrival was an expected but unwelcome punctuation mark in a story he already knew by heart. Inside the house was a museum of silence. My footsteps on the warped floorboards were muffled thuds, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I set my briefcase down on a table layered with a fine gray powder, the ghost of settled time. My job was simple, methodical. Find the will, inventory the assets, arrange for the sale of the property. A straightforward bit of legal housekeeping. But the chair in the corner watched me, and the silence had a weight to it, a density that pressed against my eardrums. I began in the study, a room lined with books, whose spines were cracked and bleached by the sun. Gene Harrow's papers were in a remarkable state of order, yet there was a strange tension in their neatness. It was the order of obsession, not organization. Receipts for groceries dated 20 years back were filed beside property tax statements. And then I found the photographs. They were tucked into a leather-bound ledger, black and white snapshots of a woman. She was beautiful in a stark, severe way, with dark hair pulled tightly back from a high forehead, and eyes that seemed to look through the camera, through time, and directly at me. In one, she stood in the overgrown garden outside, her hand resting on the shoulder of that same wing chair, which had been moved onto the patio. Her expression was not a smile, but a profound and unsettling stillness. A sound pulled me from my reverie, a soft, rhythmic creak. It came from the hallway. I stood, my own joints protesting the movement, and went to the door. The hall was empty, a tunnel of deepening shadow as the afternoon light began to fail. The creaking came again, a gentle back-and-forth sound. I followed it to a closed door at the end of the hall. I turned the cold brass knob and pushed. It was a child's room. Faded wallpaper patterned with rocking horses curled at the seams. A small bed with a patchwork quilt. And in the center of the room, a wooden rocking horse, its paint chipped to reveal the pale, splintered wood beneath. It was rocking, slowly, steadily, as if an invisible child had just climbed down from its back. The motion stopped the moment I fully crossed the threshold. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. I told myself it was the draft, the settling of an old house, a trick of the wind. But the air in the room was perfectly still, and the window was latched shut. That night, I decided to stay in the house. The drive back to the city was long, and a stubborn professional pride insisted I not be frightened away by creaking floorboards and an overactive imagination. I built a small, pathetic fire in the hearth and dragged the mattress from Gene Harrow's bed down to the study, placing it as far from that watching chair as possible. Sleep was a shallow, fitful thing. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the firelight throwing leaping, monstrous shadows on the walls. In the space between dream and waking, I heard it again. Not a creak, but a whisper. It was the softest of sounds, a sigh of fabric, the faintest exhalation of breath. It came from the chair. I lay frozen, my eyes squeezed shut, pretending to be asleep. The whisper came again, not a word, but a feeling. A sensation of profound sorrow that seeped into the room like a chill. I could smell it now, a faint trace of lilac perfume, cloying and funereal, cutting through the smell of dust and smoke. I dared to open my eyes, just a sliver. The fire had died to embers, but in the deep red glow, I saw a shape, a deepening of shadow in the confines of the wing chair. It was the impression of a person, a woman, her head tilted as if gazing out the dark window. A coldness radiated from that corner, a dry, bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The next morning, the world had returned to a brittle normality. Sunlight, weak and diluted, streamed through the dirty windows. The chair was just a chair again, empty and inert. But the memory of the cold and the scent of lilac were branded onto my senses. I needed answers. I drove back into Stillwater, the village looking even more forlorn and shuttered in the gray morning light. I found a local diner, a place called the Mill House, its windows steamy from the breath of a few elderly patrons. I ordered coffee and asked the waitress, a woman with a tired, kind face, about Jean Harrow. Her smile tightened. "Don't know much," she said, wiping the counter with a damp cloth. "Kept to himself." "What about the woman?" I asked, pushing one of the photographs I'd brought across the counter. "Did he have a wife? A daughter?" The woman's face went pale. She glanced furtively at the other customers, who had fallen silent and were now studying their plates with intense interest. "That's Ilara," she whispered, the name sounding like a curse. "Best leave that be, mister. Some stories ain't for telling." "I need to know," I insisted, my voice low. "I'm staying in that house." Her eyes widened with a genuine fear. "You're staying there? In the Harrow house?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a thread of sound. "Jean Harrow was a good man once, a schoolteacher. He and Ilara, they had a little girl. Clara, pretty thing." She swallowed hard. "There was a fire. The schoolhouse. Jean was inside. Got out with a few of the older boys. But Clara and Ilara, who'd gone in after her, they never came out." The story unfolded in fits and starts, pieced together from her reluctant whispers and the grim, confirming silence of the other patrons. The official report called it a tragic accident, a faulty wood stove. But the village had its own story. They whispered that Jean, in his panic, had prioritized saving the boys from the older families, the ones with influence, leaving his own daughter for last. They said Ilara had run into the inferno, screaming her daughter's name, and that Jean, frozen by fear or something darker, had held her back, had watched as the roof collapsed. Ilara had not died in the fire. She had been pulled from the wreckage, her body horribly burned, her mind shattered. She lived another 10 years in that house with Jean, a silent, broken ghost of a woman. And then, one autumn morning, she was found dead in her chair, the high-backed wing chair by the window, her eyes open and fixed on the charred foundation of the old schoolhouse, visible through the trees. "After she died," the waitress murmured, "things started happening. The man who bought the Harrow land for a pittance, his barn burned down. The school board chairman who always defended Jean, his son drowned in the creek. They say it's just bad luck, a curse." She looked at me, her eyes full of a terrible pity. "But it ain't a curse. It's her, Ilara. She's not resting. She's tidying up." I drove back to the house, the waitress' words echoing in my mind. Tidying up. It wasn't random vengeance. It was a meticulous, spectral rectification of a past injustice. Everyone who had benefited, everyone who had turned a blind eye, was being visited by a tragedy that mirrored their own complicity. And I was in her house, going through her husband's things, preparing to sell the stage of her suffering to strangers. I was part of the machinery that was trying to erase it all. The house felt different when I returned. The silence was no longer passive. It was watchful, expectant. The chair in the corner seemed to have gathered more shadow around itself. I knew what I had to do. I went to the study and found Gene Harrow's will. It was as orderly as the rest of his papers, leaving everything to a distant cousin. But tucked behind it was another document, written in a shaky, spidery hand. It was a letter from Gene to Alara, written after the fire. "My dearest Alara," it began, "the silence in this house is a physical thing. It is the silence you left behind. I hear your footsteps sometimes on the stairs and I turn, but there is only the dust motes dancing in the sun. I know what you believe, that I chose them over our Clara, that I valued my standing, the approval of those men, over the life of our child. I cannot undo that moment of cowardice, that frozen instant when I failed you both. I live in that fire every day. I see her face in the window of the schoolhouse. I see your eyes as you fought against me. I am the ghost here, Alara, not you. I am the one trapped in this chair, in this house, waiting for a forgiveness that will never come." I dropped the letter as if it had burned me. He had not held her back out of malice, but out of a desperate, selfish love, a fear of losing her too. And in doing so, he had lost everything anyway. He had lived his life as a penance, haunted not by his wife's ghost, but by the memory of his own failure. The vengeful spirit was not a mindless force of nature. It was a mother's love, twisted by tragedy and betrayal into something relentless and pure in its hatred. The revelation did not bring peace. It deepened the horror. This was not a ghost to be understood or appeased. Her purpose was as sharp and focused as a surgeon's scalpel, and I realized with a dawning, icy terror that my work here was almost done. I was the final piece. The solicitor who would close the file, sell the house, and officially lay the past to rest. I was the eraser. As if summoned by my realization, the temperature in the room plummeted. The scent of lilac bloomed, so thick and sweet it was suffocating. I looked up. The wing chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, not a shimmering apparition, but a solid, tangible darkness, a cutout shape of absolute blackness against the fabric. I could not see her face, but I could feel her gaze, a pressure against my skin that was colder than ice. I tried to speak, to apologize, to explain that I was just a functionary, a cog in a machine, but my voice was gone, stolen by the cold. The shadows in the room began to stretch and bleed, flowing from the corners like spilled ink, swallowing the bookshelves, the desk, the floor. They climbed my legs, a sensation not of wetness, but of a profound, static numbness, as if my very cells were being unmade. I saw images flash before my eyes, not my own memories, but hers. The orange hell of the fire, the scream of a child's name swallowed by roaring flames, the feeling of a husband's hands, not saving, but condemning. I felt her despair, her rage, her bottomless, eternal grief. It was a poison flooding into me, and I knew that this was her vengeance for me. Not a fiery death or a drowning, but this. To be made to feel the full, unendurable weight of her sorrow. To be buried alive in another's pain. I must have lost consciousness, because I awoke on the floor of the study, the gray light of dawn filtering through the window. I was shivering, my body aching as if I had a terrible flu. The room was normal. The shadows were just shadows. The chair was empty. I did not finish my work. I left the papers, the ledgers, the photographs, everything exactly as it was. I walked out of the Harrow house, got into my car, and drove away from Stillwater. I never filed a report. I had told my firm there was a legal complication, an issue with the title, and that the case was best left dormant. They assigned me other files in other brighter towns. Months have passed. I sit in my own apartment now, in a city full of noise and light. But the silence of that house followed me home. It lives inside me. Sometimes when I am drifting off to sleep, I catch the faintest scent of lilac on the air. I will turn my head on the pillow and see, from the corner of my eye, the familiar shape of a high-backed chair in the darkness of the corner. It is just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the street lamp outside my window. I know this. I tell myself this every time. But I have learned that some stories are not for telling, and some silences are not empty. They are full of a presence that waits, patient and eternal, for the final page to be turned, for the last light to be extinguished, for everything to return to the perfect, terrible stillness from which it came. The firm sent 3 follow-up emails before they closed the file. My supervisor, a man named Davies, whose world was composed of billable hours and letterhead, called me into his office. He asked if I was feeling well, if I needed to take some time. I looked at the potted fern in the corner of his room, its leaves a vibrant, impossible green, and I thought of the faded rocking horses in that small, airless room. I told him I was fine, just overworked. He accepted this because it was a language he understood. I tried to return to my life. I went to the cinema and watched explosions and car chases that seemed like childish pantomimes. I met friends for drinks in loud, crowded bars, but their laughter sounded thin and far away. A transmission from a distant, safer planet. The world had become a veneer, a thin sheet of glass, laid over a depth of cold, dark water. And I was always aware of the pressure from below. I started sleeping with the lights on. It was an impulse I was ashamed of, but the darkness in my own bedroom had become a palpable thing. It had a texture, a density that the darkness in other places did not. It was in that darkness that the scent of lilac would sometimes bloom, a few notes of perfume that would coil through the air and then vanish before I could be certain they were real. It was in that darkness that I would see the chair. Not the actual chair, of course. My apartment is furnished in clean, modern lines. But in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, in the moment when my guard was down, the shape of it would manifest in the corner, a coalescence of shadow that held a specific, familiar form. It was never occupied. It was just there, waiting. I began to research, not for the firm, but for myself. It was a compulsion, a picking at a psychic scab. I looked through old newspaper archives, searching for accounts of the Stillwater schoolhouse fire. The brief articles were dry and factual, a recitation of tragedy without context. I found a grainy photograph of the schoolhouse before the fire, a simple wooden structure, and another of the charred ruins. And then, in a local society newsletter from a year before the fire, I found a group photograph of the school children. The teacher, a young Jean Harrow, stood proudly at the back, and in the front row, a little girl with dark, serious eyes and hair in 2 long braids. Clara. Her name was printed neatly in the caption below. Seeing her face, a real living child and not a ghost story, made the horror fresh again. This was not a legend. This had happened. My research turned to the other incidents the waitress had alluded to. The man who bought the Harrow land, a farmer named Evans, did indeed lose his barn to a fire that started inexplicably in the middle of a rainstorm. The school board chairman's son, a strong swimmer, had drowned in a creek that was only 2 feet deep. The coroner had called it a tragic accident, a slip and a blow to the head. The connections were all there, a pattern of poetic, brutal justice. Tidying up, I was in a used bookstore, the smell of old paper a poor substitute for the dust of the Harrow house, when I found it. Tucked into a book of local flora was a single, faded photograph. It was Alara. She was younger than in the pictures I had found, her face softer, her eyes holding a light that had been extinguished in the later images. She was sitting in the wing chair, which was positioned on the lawn, a book open in her lap. She was looking at the photographer, Jean, presumably, with a look of such unguarded affection that it felt like a physical blow. This was the woman before the fire. This was what had been lost. I bought the book for $1, just for the photograph, and when I got home, I placed it in a drawer and shut it firmly. I could not bear to look at it, but I could not bring myself to throw it away. That night, the dream was different. I was not an observer of her memories. I was in the study of the Harrow house, but it was clean and warm, filled with afternoon light. Elara was in the chair, not as a shadow, but as the woman in the photograph, vibrant and alive. She was sewing a small white dress. She looked up at me and smiled, and it was a real smile, warm and reaching her eyes. Then the light outside the window turned orange. The smell of smoke poured down the chimney. Her smile vanished, replaced by a dawning, gut-wrenching terror. She dropped the sewing and ran from the room, her name a scream on my lips that had no sound. I tried to get up, to follow her, to stop her, but I was trapped in the chair, its wings closing in around me, the fabric the color of dried blood smothering me. I woke up gasping, the taste of ash in my mouth. The digital clock on my bedside table read 3:17 a.m. The room was dark and still, and then I heard it. Not a whisper, not a creak. A single clear and utterly lucid word, spoken directly into my ear from the empty space beside my bed. Stay. The voice was not a hiss or a moan. It was a woman's voice, parched and cracked with disuse, but filled with an iron command. It was the voice of the mother, the avenger, the eternal sentinel of that house. I did not sleep again that night. I sat on my sofa with every light blazing, watching the city through my window until the sun rose. I understood then that leaving Stillwater had changed nothing. I had carried the house with me. I was not being haunted by a place. I was being haunted by a purpose. Elara had shown me the truth of her story, not to torment me, but to recruit me. The solicitor had failed to close the file. The eraser had broken, and now I was part of the story. I was the one who knew, and knowing, I realized with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, meant I had a responsibility. The tidying up was not yet complete. There was one person left who had escaped the pattern of consequences, one person whose punishment had been a lifetime of silence and regret, but not the final, mirroring tragedy. Jean Harrow had died in his bed, a natural death. To a spirit of such absolute poetic justice, that must have seemed like an oversight. I knew, as the first rays of the sun touched the glass of the buildings across the street, that I would have to go back. Not for the firm, not for closure, but for her, to finish the story. The chair in the corner of my room was just a shadow. But it was a shadow I was now destined to follow back to its source. The silence was waiting for me to break it. The car ride back to Stillwater felt like a dream, a reversal of my frantic escape months before. The same roads, the same dying trees, but now I was driving into the heart of the silence, not away from it. The village was, if possible, even more desolate. A for sale sign was staked in front of the diner, its windows boarded up. The mill house was gone. It felt like a confirmation that I was on the right terrible path. I did not go to the Harrow house first. Instead, I drove to the cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. The wind whipped across the bare ground, carrying the smell of damp earth and decay. It took me nearly an hour to find it, a simple, weathered granite stone. Jean Harrow's name was on the left, his dates beneath. On the right, separated by a carved flourish, was Clara's name, and the single, heartbreaking word, beloved. There was no date for Elara. I walked the rows again, my eyes scanning the stones until I found a newer, smaller marker set apart under the skeletal branches of an old oak tree. It bore only her name, Elara Harrow. No dates, no epitaph. The village had not known what to say about her in life, and in death, they said nothing at all. The earth over her grave was sunken and patchy with weeds. It was the grave of someone everyone wanted to forget. I finally turned the car towards the house. It looked smaller than I remembered, more forlorn, as if it were shrinking back into the earth. The key was still where I had left it, hidden under a loose piece of siding. The door groaned open on the same stiff hinges. The air inside was stale and frigid, but the profound, watchful cold was absent. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. It was just a house now, a shell. I walked through the dusty rooms, my footsteps echoing. I went to the study. My papers were still on the desk, exactly as I had left them, covered in a fine layer of dust. The letter from Jean to Elara lay where I had dropped it. I picked it up, the paper brittle in my hands, and read his confession of ghosthood once more. He had been the ghost, he said, trapped in his chair, in his house, and now he was free. I walked to the parlor. The wing chair sat in its corner, a monument to sorrow. I approached it, my heart a dull, heavy drum in my chest. I did not know what I was doing. I had no plan, no ritual, no sage to burn. I only had the truth, and the need to speak it. I knelt before the chair, the dust on the floor soaking into the knees of my trousers. I looked at the faded floral fabric, at the hollow where a body had sat for a decade, waiting. "Elara," I said, and my voice was a dry rasp in the quiet. "I know what happened. I know what he did. I know what was taken from you." Nothing happened. The room remained still and silent. "He is gone," I continued, the words feeling inadequate, foolish. "He's beyond your reach. He died in his bed, and he is buried on the hill. He escaped you." I felt a shift then, not in the temperature, but in the pressure of the air. A subtle tightening. "It isn't fair," I whispered. The injustice of it a hot coal in my throat. "After all you suffered, he got peace, and you are still here. You are still fighting a war that only you remember." The scent of lilac began to bloom, not the suffocating way from before, but a faint, mournful trace, like a flower pressed in a book for a century. "But your war is over," I said, my voice growing stronger. "Clara is at peace. Jean is gone. The others you tidied up. Your work is done." I reached out, a reckless, instinctive gesture, and placed my hand on the arm of the chair. The fabric was ice cold, and a jolt, like a static shock, ran up my arm. "You can rest now," I said, pouring every ounce of my will into the words. "You can let go. You can go to her. Clara is waiting for you." For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a single shuddering sigh seemed to move through the house, a long-held breath released from the very timbers and floorboards. It was not a sound of sorrow, but of relief. The faint scent of lilac intensified for one beautiful, heartbreaking second, smelling not of decay, but of a fresh spring morning, and then it vanished completely. The cold in the room lifted. The pressure dissolved. The watchful presence that had filled the house for decades was simply gone. The silence that remained was different. It was not a waiting silence. It was just quiet. I stood up, my legs trembling. The chair was just a chair. The house was just a house. I had come to finish the story, and I had. I had given her the one thing she needed, the one thing no one else could give her: permission to stop. I left the house without looking back. I did not lock the door. As I drove away, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the valley in a soft, golden lights. I knew the memory would never leave me. The cold and the scent of lilac were etched into my soul, but the weight was gone. I was no longer a character in her story. I was just a man, driving down a country road, finally heading home. The sun felt warm on my face through the windshield, a genuine warmth that seemed to penetrate the lingering chill in my bones. For the first time in months, the city, when I reached it, did not feel like a flimsy disguise. The noise was just noise, not a shield against a deeper quiet. That night, I slept in my own bed, in the dark, and I did not dream. I went back to work. Davies was pleased with my renewed focus, though he occasionally glanced at me with a flicker of unspoken curiosity. I handled my files. I wrote my reports. I moved through the world of the living. I even started dating again. A woman named Sarah, who laughed with her whole body and had never heard of Stillwater. I told her I'd been through a rough patch, and she accepted that. We went to movies, and I watched them without seeing ghosts in the flickering light. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The memory of the Harrow House began to feel like a book I had read long ago, its horrors familiar but distant. I had done it. I had laid a ghost to rest. It was on a Tuesday, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, that I saw the notice. It was a small legal announcement in the back of the newspaper, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The estate of Jean Harrow, the property known as the Harrow House and its surrounding land in Stillwater, was to be auctioned off to settle outstanding municipal taxes. A sense of unease, faint but persistent, stirred in my gut. It was the final bureaucratic end, the true closing of the file. That night, I woke from a dead sleep. The room was dark and still. There was no scent of lilac, no whispering voice. But something was wrong. I sat up, my heart thudding, and looked towards the corner of the room. The shadow was there, the one that sometimes looked like a chair. But it was different. It was no longer empty. A deeper darkness sat within it, a solid, compact shape. It was the size of a child. I did not move. I did not breathe. The shape was perfectly still. I felt no malevolence, no icy hatred. I felt only a profound, bottomless sadness, a loneliness so vast it made the room feel like a hollow in the earth. And then, as I watched, the small, dark shape in the chair slowly raised one arm and pointed at me. It was not an accusation. It was a request. The truth crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsing roof. I had been wrong. So completely, tragically wrong. I had assumed Alara's only purpose was vengeance. I had thought telling her the war was over would grant her peace. But a mother's love, even one twisted by grief, is not so simple. Vengeance was only a symptom. Her true purpose, her eternal, unwavering purpose, was her child. Clara had never been at peace. She was still there, in that house, tied to her mother's rage and sorrow. Elara had not been a malevolent spirit keeping everyone away. She had been a guardian, standing watch, protecting the only thing she had left. And I had convinced her to leave. I had told her it was okay to let go. I had sent her away, and in doing so, I had left her child alone in the dark. The figure in the chair in my room began to fade, not with a sigh of relief, but with a soundless cry of despair that echoed in the silence of my soul. It dissolved, and the corner was just a shadow again. I got out of bed. I did not turn on the light. I walked to my window and looked out at the sleeping city. I had been so proud of myself for finishing the story. I had been a fool. Some stories do not have endings. Some wounds do not heal. I had not laid a ghost to rest. I had created a new one, more lost and alone than the first. I knew then that my work was not done. It had only just begun. The auction was in 3 days. I had to be there. I had to buy the house. I had to go back, not as an eraser or a solicitor, but as a caretaker. I had to find a way to reunite a mother and her child in whatever world they now inhabited. It was a task for which there was no precedent, no legal framework, no hope of success. But it was my task. The silence was no longer waiting. It was pleading, and I was the only one who could hear it. The next 2 days were a blur of logistical nightmares. Liquidating savings, making frantic calls to the bank, the cold, practical reality of money, a stark contrast to the spectral task that awaited me. Sarah noticed my distraction, the way my eyes would lose focus in the middle of a sentence. I told her it was a family matter, a vague and useless lie that hung between us. I was building a wall, brick by brick, and she was on the other side. The drive to Stillwater for the auction was nothing like the last. There was no sense of dread, only a grim, hollow determination. The village was a ghost town in the literal sense now. Only a handful of cars were parked in the gravel lot of the town hall, a squat brick building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The men inside, a collection of local officials, and a few speculative investors from the next county over, looked at me with open curiosity. I was the outsider, the city man in a too-clean coat. The auctioneer's voice was a dry monotone, listing the property's liabilities. The roof, the foundation, the well. The room was silent, uninterested. When he called for an opening bid, the silence stretched. I felt a chill, a familiar one, not from the air, but from the memory of that small, dark shape in the corner of my room. I raised my hand. The number I gave was low, obscenely low for any piece of land, even one so blighted. There were no other bids. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a definitive crack. Just like that, I owned a house of sorrow. I drove to the property immediately. The key was gone from its hiding place, but the door was unlocked. It swung inward to reveal a profound and total emptiness. The cold was gone. The scent was gone. But so was any lingering sense of life, even the troubled residual kind I had felt before. It was a vacuum. I walked through the hollow rooms, my footsteps the only sound. In the parlor, the wing chair was gone. Only a faint, lighter square on the dusty floorboards marked where it had been. Someone, the town perhaps, had cleared it out. The thought was a physical pain. I had severed the last tangible connection. I spent the first night in the house, sleeping bag laid out on the floor of the study. I slept fitfully, waiting for a sign, a whisper, the feeling of a small hand in mine. Nothing came. The silence was absolute and utterly devoid of presence. I had not brought them peace. I had created a void. The next morning I began my new work. I was not there to renovate or to sell. I was there to remember. I went to the library in the next town over and painstakingly copied every article, every mention of Clara Harrow I could find. I bought a frame and placed a photograph of her from the school group on the mantelpiece in the parlor. I found a local woodworker and commissioned a small, simple chair, a child's chair, and placed it in the corner where the wing chair had been. It was a gesture, a symbol, a place for her to sit. Days turned into weeks. I told the firm I was taking an extended leave of absence. Davis' silence on the other end of the phone was a verdict in itself. Sarah's calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. My world shrank to the boundaries of the Harrow land. I would sit for hours in the parlor, talking to the empty air. I would tell Clara stories I remembered from my own childhood. I had described what the world outside was like now, the cars and the phones and the airplanes. I apologized, over and over, for sending her mother away. I promised I would wait for her as long as it took. It was on the first night of autumn, the air sharp with the promise of frost, that I felt a change. I was sitting in the parlor, the single lamp casting a weak pool of light, reading aloud from a book of fairy tales. I had reached the story of the little mermaid who gives up her voice for legs. I finished the sad ending and closed the book. The silence that followed felt different. It was no longer empty. It was listening. And then, from the corner of the room, from the small chair I had placed there, I heard it. Not a word, but a sound. A soft, shaky, indrawn breath. It was the sound a child makes after crying for a very long time, when the tears are finally spent. I did not look up. I did not move. I simply said, into the gentle, waiting quiet, I'm here. You're not alone anymore. There was no other sound that night, but the profound, aching loneliness that had filled the house since my return was, for the first time, slightly less. It was not a reunion. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. A single, fragile thread of connection spun across the dark water. My task was clearer than ever. It was not to fix the past, but to keep a vigil in the present. To be a witness. To hold space in the world for a story that everyone else had forgotten. The ghost was no longer in the house. The ghost was in my care. Story 3. The light in the hallway did not so much burn as it breathed. It was a sickly, jaundiced thing. A gas lamp set within a tarnished brass sconce, and its flame pulsed with a low, rhythmic cadence that seemed to sync with the thrum of the old house itself. I watched it from the top of the grand staircase, my hand resting on the cold, greasy wood of the banister. Inhale, a slow swell of amber that pushed the shadows back a few reluctant inches. Exhale, a dimming that let the darkness creep in again. A tide of dust and silence. It was the house breathing, I was sure of it. And I was the unwelcome speck caught in its ancient, dusty lung. My name is Carlos. I had come to Blackfield Manor as a hired companion, a pair of steady hands and a rational mind for Darren Thorne, the last of his line. The advertisement had been specific, clipped, and offered a sum that made my practical nature override my instinctive dread. Companion wanted for gentlemen of delicate constitution. Quiet demeanor, essential. Patience, a virtue. I had pictured a frail man in a sunlit room, perhaps needing help with his correspondence or a steadying arm on a garden walk. I had not pictured this. The house was a mausoleum of forgotten grandeur. A hulking Victorian structure that slumped into the wet Pennsylvania earth as if ashamed of its own decay. The air was a perpetual broth of mildew, old roses gone to rot, and the faint, sweetish smell of sickness that no amount of open windows could ever quite scour away. And there was Darren. He was a man in his late 40s, but the house had aged him, stolen the vitality from his bones, and left him a parchment-skinned effigy propped up in a wingback chair. His eyes, a faded, watery blue, were the only part of him that seemed truly alive, and they were constantly moving, tracing the lines in the ceiling, the patterns in the rug, seeing things I could not. "It's the damp, Carlos," he would whisper, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "It gets into the mortar, into the wood, into you. It's a patient sort of hunger." I would nod, make a non-committal sound, and adjust the blanket over his knees. His sister, Bella, was a different kind of ghost. She was perhaps 10 years his junior. A wisp of a woman who drifted through the halls in a faded silk dressing gown, her pale hair always slightly undone. She spoke in fragments, her conversations a series of unfinished sentences and haunted looks. She would appear in a doorway, her large, dark eyes fixed on some middle distance, and say something like, "The roses are talking again," or, "He walks in the walls at night, you know. He doesn't mean to be loud. He doesn't mean to be loud. He's just so very heavy." Then she would be gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and a profound... My days fell into a strange hypnotic rhythm, dictated by the house's slow exhalations. I would read to Darren from heavy, leather-bound books whose pages were brittle and brown at the edges. I would take him his meals on a silver tray, the food always barely touched. I would walk the halls, my footsteps muffled by thick, dusty carpets, and feel the weight of the portraits watching me. The thorns of generations past, all with the same fever-bright eyes, the same grim set to their mouths. They were a family acquainted with sorrow, with premature ends, suicides, fevers, vanishing. The house had consumed them all. The first true omen came on a Tuesday. I was in the library, searching for a specific volume of poetry Darren had requested. The light was failing, that same sickly gaslight struggling against the encroaching evening. I pulled a book from a high shelf, and behind it, set into the wood, was a small, dark circle, about the size of a shilling. It was not a knot in the wood. It was a hole, perfectly round, and it seemed to be breathing. A faint, cold exhalation emanated from it, carrying that same sweet rot smell of the house's interior air. I leaned closer, my heart a sudden, frantic drum in my chest. I saw nothing but an absolute blackness, a void that seemed to swallow the light. And then from within that nothingness, I heard it. A soft, wet, clicking sound, like a tongue detaching from a palate. Once, twice, I stumbled back, the book falling from my hands with a muffled thud. When I looked again, the hole was gone. The shelf was solid, unbroken wood. I ran my fingers over it, feeling only the smooth, varnished surface. My rational mind, the part of me that had taken this job, screamed that it was a trick of the light, a stress-induced hallucination. But the animal part of me, the part that knew the smell of a predator, knew better. I told Darren of it that evening. He was sitting by the fire, his skeletal hands stretched towards the feeble flames. He didn't look at me. He simply nodded, a slow, weary gesture. "The house has pores, Carlos," he murmured. "It breathes, it sees, sometimes it speaks. You heard the clicking man." "The clicking man?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "A story. One of many. Grandfather told me. He's one of the hungrier ones. He likes the moist, warm places, the lungs, the throat." Darren turned his head, and his eyes finally met mine. There was no madness in them, only a terrible, exhausted clarity. "Here's why we are all so fragile." The omens began to accumulate after that, a slow, insidious drip of wrongness that eroded the shores of my sanity. I would find puddles of dark, viscous water on the floorboards in the morning, though the roof was sound. The portrait's eyes seemed to follow me with a new, specific intensity. I began to hear things at night, not the groans and settles of any old house, but a sound like something heavy and soft being dragged slowly up the main staircase, step by laborious step. I would lie in my bed, the covers pulled to my chin, and listen to it pass my door, the dragging sound accompanied by that same wet, soft clicking. Bella grew paler, more spectral. I found her one afternoon in the music room, standing perfectly still before the grand piano, her forehead resting against its closed lid. She was whispering to it. "He says the foundation is cracking. He says the roots are in the cellar, and they are thirsty. He says I will be a good sister and water them soon." I went to her, put a hand on her thin shoulder. "Bella, who says this?" She lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. "The man in the walls, the one who is always damp." She smiled then, a small, ghastly gesture. "He tastes of chimney soot and regret." That night, the revelation came. Darren took a turn for the worse. His breathing became a ragged, desperate thing, a horrible counterpoint to the steady, pulsing breath of the gaslights. I was in his room, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, when his hand shot out and gripped my wrist with a strength I did not know he possessed. His eyes were wide, blazing with a final, desperate fire. "It's not a curse, Carlos," he rasped, each word a struggle. "It's a symbiosis, a deal. The house, it feeds on us, on our essence, our madness, our sickness, our dread. It's the fuel in the lamp, the mortar in the stone. We give it our suffering, and it gives us..." He coughed, a wet, tearing sound that seemed to go on forever. But it's always hungry. It needs a new thorn, a fresh source. Bella, she is too thin, too brittle. She would break too quickly. It has been waiting for someone with stronger roots. Nah. His grip tightened, his nails digging into my flesh. "It's been waiting for you, Carlos." I tried to pull away, but his hold was iron. "What are you talking about? I'm not a thorn." "And you?" he whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Your mother, her maiden name. She never told you, did she? She ran away from this, from her duty. She thought she could escape. But the house has a long memory, and it always calls its children home." The world tilted. My mother, a quiet, nervous woman who had died young of a consumption the doctors could never quite explain. She never spoke of her family. She had a fear of large, old houses, a recurring dream of something clicking in the dark. Darren's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went limp, his hand falling from my wrist. The last breath left his body in a long, sighing rattle. And as it did, every gaslight in the house flared once, blindingly bright, and then went out, plunging us into an absolute, suffocating blackness. In the silence that followed, I heard it. The dragging sound. It was in the room with me. And the clicking, it was right beside the bed. I fumbled for a match, my hands shaking so violently I could barely strike it. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny, pathetic shield against the immense dark. I lifted it, and I saw. There was no monster, no shambling horror. The thing dragging itself across the floor was me, or a version of me made of wet black earth and the crumbling mortar of the house foundation. Its eyes were two dark, breathing holes. Its mouth opened and closed with a soft, wet click. It was a mirror of my own terror, my own impending dissolution, given form by the house. It was the essence of Blackfield Manor, and it was wearing my face. It reached for me, a hand of compacted soil and splintered bone. I should have screamed. I should have run, but a profound, icy stillness settled over me. The frantic drumming in my chest ceased. The fear evaporated, leaving behind only a vast and empty calm. This was the truth. This was my inheritance. The house was not a place I was in. The house was what I was becoming. I looked at the thing, this crawling, clicking self, and I felt nothing. No reaction. No terror. Only stillness. I blew out the match. The darkness was complete. The clicking was closer now, right at my feet. I did not move. I simply waited in the perfect, accepting silence, listening to the sound of my own arrival. The clicking stopped. The only sound was the ragged pull of my own breath and the slow, settling sigh of the house around me. The thing of earth and shadow was so close I could feel the chill of its presence, a cold radiance that seeped through the leather of my shoes. It did not touch me. It was waiting. It was a question, and my stillness was the only answer it required. Then, a new sound began. A faint, dry rustling, like old paper being carefully unfolded. It came from the hallway, growing steadily louder, resolving into the soft, shuffling tread of slippers on the carpet. A sliver of light appeared under the door, not the jaundiced pulse of the gas lamp, but the steady, warm glow of a candle. The door creaked open. Bella stood there, holding a branched candlestick. The flame illuminated her face, but it was not the vacant, ethereal woman I had known. Her expression was one of weary resignation, a grim finality that etched lines around her mouth and eyes. She looked ancient. She looked at the thing on the floor, then at me, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "He's gone then," she said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual dreamy lilt. It's faster when the line is direct. The earthen thing at my feet began to recede, not retreating, but dissolving. It bled into the floorboards, the dark, wet soil soaking into the wood until nothing remained but a damp, vaguely man-shaped stain on the rug. The clicking was gone. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, but it did not vanish. It simply redistributed itself, settling into the walls, the floor, the very air, becoming part of the background hum of the house. It was inside me too, a new, cold core of certainty. "I'm not a thorn," I said. But the words were hollow, a formality, the protest of a self that was already fading. Blood is a thread, Carlos. It doesn't care about names. It only cares about connection. The house recognized you the moment you crossed the threshold. It was just waiting for the transfer of ownership to be complete. She stepped fully into the room, her candle casting long, dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. Darren held on as long as he could. He was stubborn. But the house was hungry. It needed a stronger anchor. She walked to the bed and looked down at Darren's body. With a tenderness that surprised me, she closed his eyes. He was my brother, but in the end, he was just sustenance. We all are. She turned back to me. "You understand now, don't you? Why you couldn't leave? Why the world outside began to feel thin and unreal? This is your place. Your responsibility. Your body is your own. For now. But your breath, your fear, your very life, that belongs to the house. That belongs to the house." I looked at my hands in the candlelight. They looked the same, but they felt different. I could feel the grain of the wood in the floor through my soles, not as a sensation under my feet, but as a presence within my own bones. I could feel the vast, dark emptiness of the cellar beneath us, a hollow in my own gut. The house was no longer around me. It was me. "What do I do?" I asked. My voice was calm. It was the voice of the house now. Bella gestured toward the door. "You live. You tend to the house. You listen to its needs. And you wait. For what?" "For the next one," she said, her dark eyes holding mine. "The house will call them in time. A distant cousin. A lost soul with a drop of thorn blood. Someone strong, to keep the wall standing a little longer. You will be the caretaker, the guardian, and you will feed them to it, just as Darren fed you to me." She turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the room with the corpse of my predecessor. The candlelight flickered, and for a moment, Darren's face seemed to shift in the shadows, the grimace of his final agony softening into something that looked almost like peace. He was part of the house now, completely. His suffering was spent. I did not leave the room. I sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, listening. I heard the wind outside, but it was a distant thing, a rumor from another world. I heard the mice in the walls, their tiny, scurrying lives a brief, insignificant spark in the immense darkness. And beneath it all, I heard the new sound, the true sound. It was a low, deep, rhythmic pull, like a great, slumbering beast It was the house breathing. And now, at last, I was breathing with it. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was full. It was the silence of soil, of deep roots, of waiting. I sat in the chair as the night wore on, not sleeping, not thinking, just being a part of the quiet. The damp stain on the rug where the thing had been slowly faded, the house drinking it back into itself. When the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the grimy windows, it did not feel like a new day. It felt like a shift in phase, the closing of one cycle and the beginning of another. I stood up. My joints did not ache from the long vigil. My body felt sturdy, grounded. I looked at Darren's body, a husk now, empty of everything that had made him a temporary vessel. My duty was clear. I did not call for a doctor or an undertaker. Such things belonged to the world outside, and that world was no longer my concern. Instead, I went down to the cellar. The air was thick and cold, smelling of stone and deep earth. In the farthest corner, behind a stack of rotten crates, the earth was soft and loose. I did not need a shovel. I knelt and dug with my hands, the cool, dark soil parting for me as if it knew its master. The hole deepened quickly, and when it was deep enough, I went back upstairs. Carrying Darren was not difficult. He was shockingly light, as if the house had already consumed everything of substance. I laid him in the earth, in the dark, quiet cradle of the cellar. I did not say any words. The house needed no eulogies. As I pushed the soil back over him, I felt a faint, satisfying thrum move through the floorboards, a pulse of contentment. The foundation felt just a little more solid. Days began to pass, though the distinction blurred. Bella and I moved through the halls like two priests in a temple. We rarely spoke. There was no need. We shared the same knowledge, the same purpose. I would find her sometimes standing perfectly still in a patch of sunlight, her eyes closed, a slight smile on her lips as she listened to something I could not hear. I was learning to listen to those things too. The house was teaching me. The sounds were no longer frightening. The dragging in the night was just the house shifting its weight. The whispers from the walls were its thoughts. I learned that the clicking man was not a monster, but a symptom, a manifestation of the house's deep, structural thirst. My own fear had given it that shape. Now that I held no fear for it, the clicking ceased. The house had no need to frighten its keeper. My old life, the life of Carlos the rational man, became a faded photograph. The memory of sunlight on a city street, the taste of coffee, the sound of a friend's laughter. It all felt like a story I had read once about someone else. This was my reality. The slow decay of the wallpaper was the shedding of my skin. The groaning of the pipes was the circulation of my blood. One evening, I was in the library, my hand resting on the very shelf where I had first seen the breathing hole. The wood was warm beneath my palm. I closed my eyes and let my awareness sink into it, following the grain down through the floor, into the foundations, through the tangled, thirsty roots beneath the house. I could feel the entire structure, every room, every brick, every splinter. It was a vast, sleeping body, and I was the mind it had grown for itself. I opened my eyes. Bella was in the doorway, watching me. "It's almost time," she said softly. I knew what she meant. I had felt it brewing for days, a new kind of tension in the walls, a fresh anticipation. The house was getting hungry again. "The advertisement?" I asked, my voice a dry rustle, perfectly suited to the dusty air. She shook her head. "No, not this time. This one will find her own way. She's driving here now, a second cousin on your mother's side. She is curious about her roots." A faint, sad smile touched Bella's lips. "She has a strong heart. It will last a long time." I nodded. A slow, deliberate motion. I felt no pity, no remorse, only a quiet sense of preparation. The house must be fed. The walls must stand. I walked to the window and looked out at the overgrown drive. The twilight was deepening, and the first of the gas lamps along the driveway flickered to life, their pulsing glow a beacon through the gathering mist. A beacon for the next one, the new blood. I turned from the window and went to make sure the guest room was ready. The room was at the front of the house, overlooking the drive. It was the one I had first stayed in, a lifetime ago. I opened the door, and the air inside was still and expectant. I ran a cloth over the dresser, not because there was dust, but because the ritual of it felt right. The house appreciated ritual. I straightened the coverlid on the bed and ensured the pitcher of water on the nightstand was full. It was not for drinking. It was a courtesy, a way to make the new arrival feel at ease before the unease began to settle in. As I worked, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a gentle pull towards the window. I obeyed, looking down just as a pair of headlights cut through the mist, painting the gravel in two long, weak beams. A small, sensible car came to a hesitant stop. The engine died, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the car door opened and a woman stepped out. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with a bright, colorful scarf tied in her hair. A splash of foreign vibrancy against the monochrome gloom of Blackfield. She stood for a moment, hugging her coat around herself, looking up at the facade with an expression not of fear, but of determined curiosity. I could feel the house tasting her from here, sampling her resolve, her vitality. It was pleased. I heard Bella's soft step behind me. "She has your mother's chin," she murmured. I saw it then, the faint, stubborn set of the jaw that I remembered from old photographs. Old, hard certainty settled within me. This was not a stranger. This was family. "I will greet her," I said, my voice no longer my own, but the voice of the house speaking through me. I walked down the grand staircase, my footsteps silent on the worn runner. The front door was already unlocked. It always was for those who were expected. I pulled it open just as she was reaching for the knocker. She started, taking a half step back. Her eyes, wide and intelligent, scanned my face. "Oh, hello. I'm looking for Darren Thorne. My name is Eliza. Eliza Vance. Darren is no longer with us," I said, the words smooth and practiced. "I am the caretaker, Carlos. Please, come in out of the damp." A flicker of disappointment crossed her face, followed by sympathy. "I'm so sorry to hear that. I was hoping to learn more about the family." She stepped across the threshold, her movements quick and alive. She shivered slightly as the house's interior air, sweet and rotten, wrapped around her. "The house holds all the stories," I said, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. "It is eager to share them." She looked around the foyer, her gaze lingering on the portraits. "It's even bigger than I imagined, and so quiet." "It is a house that listens more than it speaks," I replied. "You must be tired from your journey. I've prepared a room for you." I led her up the stairs, feeling the floorboards press up against my soles with a quiet hunger. She chatted nervously about her drive, about how she'd found the old letters that mentioned Blackfield, about her desire to connect with her heritage. I made non-committal sounds of acknowledgement. The house was listening, learning the cadence of her voice, the rhythm of her heart. I showed her to the room. She thanked me, her eyes already looking past me, drawn to the shadows in the corner. "It's a little chilly," she remarked, rubbing her arms. "The house breathes deeply at night," I explained. "You will grow accustomed to it." I left her there, closing the door softly. I did not go far. I stood in the hallway, my back against the wall, and became still. I could feel the house's attention focused on the room, a slow, probing pressure. I heard her moving about, the squeak of the floorboards beneath her unfamiliar weight. Then, a soft gasp. I knew what she had seen. The damp patch on the rug, the one that had never fully vanished, had darkened, spreading into a shape that vaguely resembled a human form lying in repose. It was the house's first whisper to her, a welcome and a warning. I heard her walk to the door, hesitate, and then turn back. She was brave. She was trying to rationalize it. A spill, a leak, anything but the truth. I smiled in the darkness, a slow, cold stretching of lips that felt less like my own every day. The rationalization was the most important part. It was the thread by which the house would slowly reel her in. Downstairs, I found Bella standing at the foot of the stairs, her head tilted as if listening to a beautiful, distant piece of music. "She is strong," Bella said without looking at me. "Yes," I agreed. "She will last a long time." I walked into the library and took my seat in the high-backed chair by the cold fireplace. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of a predator that has sighted its prey and is content to wait. I closed my eyes and settled in to wait with it. The roots were thirsty, and the new water had just arrived. The silence of the house changed that night. It was no longer a waiting silence, but a hunting one. I could feel its focus, a subtle pressure that centered on the room above me. Eliza was quiet for a long time, and I imagined her sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to process the strangeness, dismissing the shape on the rug as a trick of the light and her own tired mind. The house would allow her that. It was patient. Hours later, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. A scratching. It wasn't the frantic scrabbling of an animal in the walls. This was deliberate, almost gentle, like a fingernail tracing the grain of the wood on the other side of her door. It was the house testing her, seeing what kind of fear she was made of. I heard her bed springs creak. A moment of silence, then the cautious tread of her feet approaching the door. The scratching stopped. Another silence, longer this time. She did not open the door. She was smart, but the house was smarter. It had planted a seed. When she returned to her bed, the silence would feel heavier, and the darkness outside her window would feel closer. The next morning, she came down to breakfast. Bella had laid out a simple meal of tea and toast. Eliza looked pale, with shadows under her eyes, but she offered a bright, determined smile. "I didn't sleep very well," she confessed, stirring her tea. "This old house makes so many noises." No one. "It has its own language," I said from my seat at the head of the table. "It talks in its sleep." She laughed, a little too high-pitched. "I suppose it does." I kept hearing this, scratching. Probably just a tree branch against the window. "Probably," I agreed. Her eyes darted around the dining room, taking in the heavy drapes and the somber portraits. "It's funny," she said, lowering her voice. "I had the strangest dream. There was a man made of mud, standing at the foot of my bed. He just watched me." Bella, who was clearing plates, went very still. She looked at me, a silent message passing between us. The house was working quickly. It had liked the taste of her. "He was probably just a dream," Eliza said, shaking her head as if to clear it. "My imagination always runs wild in new places." "The house encourages that," I said. "It enjoys stories." For the next few days, he played the part of the enthusiastic genealogist. She spent her days in the library, poring over the moldering ledgers and brittle letters, tracing the tangled thorn family tree. She would often come to me with questions, her face alight with discovery. "Carlos, look at this," she said one afternoon, holding up a faded photograph. "This is your great-grandmother. I see the resemblance in your eyes." I looked at the stern, unsmiling woman in the photograph. I felt nothing. The face was a stranger's. My family tree was not in a book. Its roots were in the cellar. Its branches were the corridors of this house. As she delved deeper into the past, the house delved deeper into her. The scratching at the door became a nightly occurrence. The damp patch on her rug grew, sometimes seeming to shift its form. She began to complain of the cold, no matter how many blankets she piled on her bed. The vibrant scarf she had arrived with was tucked away in a drawer, its color too loud for the creeping gloom that was settling over her. One evening, a week after her arrival, I found her in the library not reading, but simply staring into the cold fireplace. Her shoulders were slumped, the initial energy completely drained from her. "It's so quiet here," she said without turning around. "Not just no sound, but a heavy quiet. I haven't had a single phone signal since I arrived. It's like the outside world has just vanished." "It has," I said simply. She finally turned to look at me. The curiosity in her eyes had been replaced by a dawning, weary dread. "What is this place, Carlos? Really?" "It is home," I said. "For you, for now." The understanding broke over her face, not in a sudden shock, but in a slow, terrible wave. She saw the emptiness in my eyes, the way I stood, not as a man in a house, but as the house itself. She looked past me to the doorway, where Bella stood, a silent, sorrowful sentinel. "No," she whispered, backing away from me. "I want to leave. I'm leaving now." She ran for the front door. I did not try to stop her. Bella and I simply watched as she wrestled with a heavy bolt, her hands slipping in her panic. The bolt would not move. It hadn't moved for anyone but us since the day I buried Darren. She began to scream then, a raw, frantic sound that was quickly swallowed by the hungry silence of the halls. She pounded on the solid oak, her fists making dull, impotent thuds. I walked up behind her, my footsteps silent. I placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched violently, whirling around to face me, her back pressed against the unyielding door. "Shh," I said, my voice the rustle of dead leaves in a deep well. "The struggle only makes it worse. It only makes the house thirstier." Her eyes were wide with pure terror, the kind that has forgotten all reason. It was the most potent sustenance the house could receive. I could feel a deep, resonant satisfaction thrumming through the floorboards, a vibration that traveled up through my bones. "The clicking man is not coming for you, Eliza," I whispered, leaning close. "He is a part of me now. But the house has other voices. It will find the one you fear the most." I took her arm. My grip was not harsh, but it was absolute, like the grip of the earth itself. She was too weak, too broken to resist. I led her, stumbling and sobbing, not back to her room, but down the hallway towards the grand staircase. The house was ready for its meal. It was time to show her where the roots truly lay. It was time to take her to the cellar. Her sobs were the only human sound in the house, a fragile counterpoint to the deep, resonant silence that absorbed them. She pulled against my arm, but her strength was already leaching away, drawn out by the porous walls and the attentive darkness. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I won't tell anyone. I'll just disappear. You can say I left." "You will disappear," I said, my tone flat and factual. "And you have already left. There is no going back from this." We reached the cellar door. It was unassuming, a plain, painted slab of wood that most visitors would never notice. I opened it, and the cold, damp air from below rushed out to meet us, carrying the rich, final scent of wet soil and stone. Eliza recoiled, planting her feet, a last, desperate resistance. "No, not down there. Please, not down there." The house did not like this delay. A painting further down the hall swung away from the wall with a sharp crack, the glass over the portrait shattering on the floor. Eliza jumped, a short, choked scream escaping her lips. The house was growing impatient. Its hunger was a physical presence now, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. I pulled her forward, and she stumbled on the top step. I kept her upright, guiding her down into the darkness. I didn't need a light. My feet knew every worn dip in the stone steps. The cellar was not a place of pitch blackness, but of deep green-tinged gloom. fed by a faint, phosphorescent fungus that grew in veins across the mortar. At the bottom, I released her arm. She crumpled to her knees on the hard-packed earth, her body racked with silent tremors. She was looking at the far corner, at the patch of disturbed soil where Darren lay. She seemed to understand instinctively what it was. "This is where it happens," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "This is where it ends," I corrected her, "and where it continues." I walked to the corner and knelt. I didn't look back at her. I began to dig with my hands, the cool, dark earth yielding to me as it always did. The sound of my digging was the only sound, a soft, rhythmic shuffling. I could feel Eliza's terror, like a cold wind at my back. And I could feel the house drinking it in. A deep, sustained draft that strengthened the very stones around us. I heard her scramble to her feet. I thought she might try to run, to rush past me up the stairs, but she didn't. Instead, she spoke, her voice suddenly clear and eerily calm. "It's in you, isn't it?" she said. "The house. It's not just around you. It's inside you." I paused, my hands buried in the soil. I looked over my shoulder at her. She was standing straight, her face pale but composed in the ghastly green light. The last of her resistance had burned away, leaving behind a stark, unvarnished truth. "Yes," I said. "We are the same." She nodded slowly, a gesture of acceptance that was more terrible than any scream. "Then it will be in me too. A part of me will stay here. In the walls." "A part of you will become the walls," I said. "It is a form of immortality. Your strength will give it life." She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing at the edge of the hole I had dug. It was deep enough. She looked down into it, then at my earth-stained hands. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "The fear is the only part that hurts," I said. "The rest is just returning." She closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. When she opened them, there was a strange light in them, a flicker of the curiosity that had first brought her here. "Show me," she said. I rose and took her hand. It was cold. She didn't fight as I helped her into the earthy cradle. She lay down, arranging herself almost as if for sleep, folding her hands over her stomach. She looked up at the low, fungus-streaked ceiling of the cellar, her expression unreadable. I began to push the soil over her. It was a slow, deliberate process. First her feet, then her legs, the dark earth covering the bright fabric of her jeans. She flinched when it reached her torso, a primal reflex she couldn't suppress, but she did not cry out. She turned her head and looked at me, her eyes wide, capturing the faint green light. "Tell me a story," she whispered, her voice already muffled by the earth. So I did. As I covered her arms, her chest, her shoulders, I spoke in a low, monotone voice. I told her the story of the house, not from the ledgers, but from the memories in the stones. I told her about the first Thorn who had built his home on this thirsty ground, and the pact he had made. I told her about the long line of keepers, and the long line of guests who had stayed to nourish the foundations. When the earth reached her chin, she was still listening, her eyes fixed on mine. There was no hatred in them, only a profound, weary understanding. "Thank you," she breathed, the words barely audible. Then I covered her face. The silence that followed was absolute and complete. It was a saturated silence, a well-fed silence. I stood over the freshly turned earth and felt a new solidity settle into the house. A new thread was woven into the tapestry of its being. The roots beneath my feet were satisfied, their thirst slaked for now. I climbed the stairs, leaving the darkness behind. Bella was waiting in the hallway above. She held out a damp cloth. I took it and wiped the dark soil from my hands and forearms. "She was strong," Bella said again. But this time, it was an epitaph. "She is strong," I corrected. She is part of the strength now. I walked to the front door and drew back the heavy bolt. I opened it and looked out at the overgrown drive, the mist, the silent, watching trees. The barrier was restored, stronger than ever. I closed the door, the sound a firm final period at the end of a sentence. My vigil was over. The house was sated. I went to the library and sat in my chair. I closed my eyes and listened. I could hear the new voice in the whisper of the pipes. A faint melodic thread woven into the chorus. Eliza was home, and so was I. Story 4. The door to room 217 was not a door. It was a tooth. That was the thought that came to me, Brant. In the long gray stretch of the afternoon, I stood at the end of the hallway on the 3rd floor of the Overlook Hotel, and I looked at it. The other doors were a uniform, dull cream, with polished brass numbers. But 217 was a deeper, older shade. The color of a blood stain on a wall after you've tried to scrub it away. Its grain did not run straight up and down, but swirled inward, a slow, dark vortex. The brass handle was not a handle, but a tongue, waiting to be depressed. The whole thing was set just a fraction of an inch too deep into the wall, as if the hotel were preparing to swallow it whole. My father, Duane, would have laughed his new, thin laugh, and told me I had too much imagination. He said the mountain air was good for that it would blow the cobwebs out of my head. But the air in the Overlook didn't blow. It sat. It was a patient, silent air, heavy with the smell of old wood polish and the cold, whetstone breath of the boilers deep in the basement. It was the kind of air that listened. We'd been here for 3 weeks, though it felt like 3 months or 3 years. My father had lost his job at the community college, something vague about budget cuts and a disagreement with the dean. And this position as the winter caretaker for the vast empty Overlook had been a desperate gift. A salary, a roof, and solitude. My mother, Autumn, had tried to make our suite on the 1st floor feel like home. She'd laid out a faded floral quilt on my bed and put a pot of fake geraniums on the small table where we ate. But the quilt was a small, sad flag of defiance in a sea of garish, patterned carpet, and the geraniums were a lie. Nothing real grew here. My father was down in the basement now, I knew, walking the long, low-ceilinged corridors, checking the gauges on the great sleeping boilers. He went there more and more. He said it was the heart of the place, that you had to keep the heart beating. But when he came back up, his hands would be trembling and there would be a smell on him. A smell like old pennies and damp earth. He would look at my mother not with love, but with a kind of frantic need, his eyes begging for something she could not name. And he would look at me with a flicker of something else, something that was almost fear. I could feel things, not see them, not like in the movies. It was a pressure, a temperature change behind my eyes, a taste in the back of my throat. The Overlook was a symphony of these sensations, a constant, low hum of forgotten moments. The grand ballroom tasted of flat champagne and cigarette smoke, and the pressure there was a frantic, giddy weight, the ghost of a crowd trying too hard to have fun. The long, empty corridor of the guest rooms on the 2nd floor was cold, a deep and personal cold that made my teeth ache. But room 217 was different. It was a silence, a perfect, absolute silence that sucked all the other sounds and feelings into it. I took a step closer. The swirling grain of the door seemed to pulse, a slow, lazy contraction. The hallway stretched behind me, an impossible length of identical carpet and wallpaper, the pattern repeating itself into a dizzying infinity. The empty space was not empty. It was full of watching. My mother found me there. She didn't speak, just placed a hand on my shoulder. Her hand was always cold now. "Brent," she whispered, and her voice was thin, strained. "Don't wander up here. Your father, he doesn't like it." "The door is breathing," I said. not looking at her. She didn't tell me I was being silly. She just squeezed my shoulder tighter, her fingers like little bones. "Come downstairs. I'll make you some cocoa." As we walked away, I felt the silence from room 217 follow us, a hole moving through the substance of the world. That night, the dreams began. Not my dreams. Their dreams. I would wake up with the taste of my father's anger in my mouth, a hot, metallic burn, or the sound of my mother's silent weeping echoing in my ears. I was a radio receiver, and the Overlook was broadcasting on every frequency. One morning, after a night filled with the sensation of falling down a deep, dry well, I found my father in the kitchen. He was staring at the model of the Overlook he was building from a kit, an intricate little replica of the hotel itself. His hands were poised over it, a tiny flagpole in one, a pot of glue in the other. He wasn't moving. He was just staring at the tiny, perfect front doors. "The hedge animals," he murmured, without looking up. "They move at night. Did you know that, Brent? The topiary, the lions, they turn their heads." I looked at the model. On the little lawn, he had glued down bits of green sponge for the hedges. They were just sponges. "No, Dad." His eyes snapped to me. They were wide. The blue of them faded, the whites webbed with red. "You don't see it. You, with your feelings." He said the word like it was a curse. "You don't feel them out there, watching the windows." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning. I did feel it. A patient, vegetative malevolence from the grounds. But I shook my head. He looked back at the model. Of course you don't," he whispered. "It's the isolation. It's getting to me. The silence." He picked up a tiny plastic figure, a man no bigger than a fingernail. He held it over the model's roof. So much silence. The next week, the snows came. They fell for 2 days and 2 nights, a relentless white curtain that sealed us in. The world shrank to the size of the hotel. The phones went dead. The radio spat only static. We were alone. Truly alone, except for the things that were in here with us. My father's walks to the basement became longer. He started talking to himself. Low, guttural conversations I couldn't quite make out. My mother flitted from room to room, cleaning things that were already clean, her movements quick and bird-like, her eyes never still. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The sounds began. A party in the ballroom, the faint tinkle of a piano and the murmur of voices, when we knew the room was dark and locked. A child's rubber ball, thumping slowly, methodically, down a staircase in the dead of night. The sound of it was like a dying heartbeat. I started spending my days in the cavernous kitchen, away from the guest floors. It was there I found the photograph, tucked behind a giant can of peaches in the pantry. It was an old, sepia-toned picture of a party. Men in tuxedos, women in flapper dresses. And in the center, a man in a white suit, his arm around a beautiful, dark-haired woman. He was smiling, but his eyes were like 2 chips of black ice. They seemed to look right out of the paper, right at me. The pressure behind my eyes flared into a sharp, specific pain. This man, he was important. His name was Ignacio. The knowledge was just there, planted in my mind. That night, I woke up because the silence was gone. It had been replaced by a low, rhythmic scraping sound. I got out of bed and crept to my door. The hallway outside our suite was dark. The scraping was coming from the lobby. I followed it, my bare feet silent on the carpet. My father was there. He was on his hands and knees, pushing a large, heavy industrial polisher back and forth across the floor. But there was no polish. The machine was dry, its brush whirring uselessly against the wood, screeching and scraping. He was muttering, his voice a dry rasp. Have to keep it clean. Have to keep it shining. For the guests, they'll be here soon. He doesn't like a mess. He doesn't like dust. I saw who he was talking to. Propped in a high-backed chair near the great fireplace was a man. He was dressed in a white suit, immaculate. It was the man from the photograph. Ignacio. He wasn't solid, not quite. You could see the pattern of the chair's fabric through his shoulders. But he was there. He smiled at my father's frantic, useless labor. A smile of infinite coldness and amusement. Then he turned his head. He looked at me. His eyes were not human. They were voids, windows into a space where stars had gone out. The world tilted. The scraping sound became the only thing in the universe. I felt a pull, a terrible, gravitational pull from those eyes. I was falling into them. A hand closed over mine. It was warm, a real warmth. I tore my gaze away from the thing in the chair and looked up. A man stood beside me. He was dressed in worn, old-fashioned work clothes. He had a kind, tired face, and his eyes held the same deep, knowing sadness that I sometimes felt in my own soul. "Don't look at him, son," the man whispered, his voice like the rustle of old leaves. "He feeds on the looking." He pulled me gently back, away from the lobby, around a corner. The scraping sound faded, replaced by the frantic beating of my own heart. "I'm Ignacio," the man said. "I was the caretaker. Before your father. Before the one before him. Mananaster." The man in the chair. I stammered. "Is also Ignacio," he said, and his smile was bitter. "Or what's left of me that this place liked. It finds a weakness, a crack, and it pours itself in. It made a copy. A bad copy. It wears you, you see. Like a suit of clothes. It is wearing what I was." He looked at me, his eyes full of a terrible pity. "You have the shine, boy. Stronger than mine ever was. That's why it wants you. It's tired of these broken men. It wants a vessel that can really hold it." "What is it?" I asked, my voice a thin thread of sound. He shook his head. "It's the hotel. The hotel is a thought. A hungry thought. It's the echo of every terrible thing that ever happened within these walls. And there have been so many. It grows in the silence. It thrives on the isolation. And it is so hungry." From the lobby, we heard my father let out a choked cry, followed by a crash. The warm Ignacio's form flickered, like a candle in a draft. "It knows I'm here. I can't stay. I'm just a stain. A memory it missed." He squeezed my hand. "The little boy. In the drain pipe. Find him. He knows the way out." And he was gone. The space where he had been was just empty air, but it still held a trace of his warmth, like a sunbeam on a cold floor. I didn't sleep again that night. I huddled in my bed, listening. The scraping had stopped. Now there was only the sound of the wind outside, a low moan that sounded like the hotel itself was in pain. The next day, my father was different. Calm? Too calm. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a still, cold certainty. He didn't speak to my mother. He just looked at her, and she shrunk under his gaze. He looked at me, and his eyes were no longer my father's eyes. They were flat, reflective, like the eyes of the hedge animals. I remembered what the warm Ignacio had said. The little boy. The drain pipe. During the brief hours of afternoon light, I put on my snowsuit and went outside. The world was a blinding, painful white. The topiary animals were half buried in drifts, but the lion's head was turned, just as my father had said, its snow-covered face now staring directly at the hotel's main entrance. I felt its gaze, a prickling on the back of my neck. I fought my way through the deep snow to the side of the hotel. to where a large wrought iron drain pipe descended from the roof. It was clogged with ice. I kicked at it, my boots making dull thuds against the frozen metal. I scraped at the ice with my mittens. Nothing. Then I heard it. A tiny, muffled voice. "In here." I knelt down. The voice was coming from the base of the pipe, where it entered the ground. "I'm stuck," the voice said. It was a little boy's voice, thin and watery. "He chased me, the man in the dog suit. He was laughing." A wave of cold that had nothing to do with the weather washed over me. I saw it for a fleeting second. The man on all fours, something furry and wrong. A grinning mask, chasing a small, terrified child through these very corridors. "How do I get out?" I whispered, my lips close to the cold iron. "The snowmobile," the voice whispered back. "The key is in the green box, by the generator, but he'll hear it. He hears everything." The generator shed. In the basement. I went back inside, my heart a trapped bird beating against my ribs. The hotel felt different now. It was no longer just watching. It was waiting. It knew I had a plan. I could feel its attention focused on me. A spotlight of pure malice. I found my mother in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. She looked ancient. "Mom," I said, "we have to go. Now." She shook her head slowly. "He's your father, Brent." "He's not," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Not anymore. The hotel is wearing him." A door slammed downstairs. Heavy footsteps began to climb the stairs to our floor. Slow, deliberate. Thump, 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 but my mother's eyes widened in terror. The sound was not my father's gait. It was something heavier, something that did not need to breathe. "The basement," I hissed. "We have to get to the generator shed." We ran, not to the main stairs, but to the narrow service staircase at the back of the kitchen. The air grew colder as we descended, the smell of damp and iron thickening. The footsteps from above changed direction. They knew. The basement was a labyrinth of concrete and groaning pipes. The single, bare bulb that lit the main corridor flickered, casting jumping, monstrous shadows. We reached the generator room. I fumbled with a latch on the green metal box, bolted to the wall. Inside, on a hook, was a single silver key. The snowmobile key. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. They started down, not hurried, confident. "Go," my mother whispered, pushing me toward the exterior door that led to the snowmobile shed. "Go, Brent." I shoved the key into the lock of the heavy metal door. It turned with a loud, protesting shriek of rusted metal. I looked back. My father stood at the bottom of the stairs. He held a large, heavy mallet from the boiler room. His face was a blank mask. But his eyes were the swirling, dark grain of the door to room 217. He was not my father. He was the Overlook. "You're disturbing the guests, son," he said, and his voice was a chorus. 100 voices speaking at once, old and young, male and female. It was the voice of the hotel. My mother screamed and threw herself at him. It was a hopeless, brave, desperate act. The mallet swung. There was a sound I will hear forever, a wet, final thud. She fell, a small broken doll on the concrete floor. The thing that was my father took a step toward me. I yanked the door open. The cold air hit me like a physical blow. The snowmobile was there, a hulking shape under a canvas tarp. I scrambled onto it, my fingers numb, fumbling for the ignition. He was coming through the door. I jammed the key in, turned it. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. He was right behind me, the mallet raised high. his face a rictus of ancient hatred. I gunned the throttle. The snowmobile shot forward out of the shed into the blinding white. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I aimed for the tree line, for the road that was buried somewhere beneath tons of snow, the only way down the mountain. The roar of the engine was the only sound in the world. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of life. And then it died. It didn't sputter or choke. It just stopped. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a physical weight crushing me. I looked down at the ignition. The key was gone. It had simply vanished. I sat there, in the deep, pristine snow, in the perfect, watchful silence. I felt the hotel behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. I could feel its vast, hungry presence. Its satisfaction. The cold began to seep through my snowsuit. It was a deep, profound cold that felt like it was coming from inside my own bones. I closed my eyes. I am in my bed. The quilt is the one with the faded rocket chips. The room is warm. Sunlight is streaming through the window, painting dancing patterns on the wall. I can smell pancakes. My mother is singing downstairs, her voice light and sweet. My father is in his study, the low murmur of a baseball game on his radio. The sound of the crowd is a gentle, happy buzz. He will call me soon. He will call me to come sit with him, to watch the game. He will ruffle my hair. His hand will be warm. The sunlight is so bright. It is so bright. It's so bright. The brightness was a lie. It was the clean, white lie of fresh snow covering a grave. The warmth of the quilt was a memory, a phantom sensation that my skin refused to believe. The smell of pancakes was a ghost in the air, a cruel trick played by a mind that was breaking. I opened my eyes. I was not in my bed. I was in the lobby, sitting in the high-back chair by the great stone fireplace. The chair where the man in the white suit had sat. I was cold, so cold that my teeth wanted to chatter, but a force I could not name kept them locked together. He stood before me, my father. The mallet was gone. His hands hung loose at his sides. He looked tired. He looked like my father again. "Brent," he said, and his voice was his own, cracked and weary. "I'm so sorry. I lost my temper. Your mother, she fell." I said nothing. I just looked at him. I looked past the familiar lines of his face, past the pleading in his eyes. I looked for the swirling darkness, for the chorus of voices. It was there, just beneath the surface, a patient, oily presence waiting for me to believe the lie. "It's over now," he said, taking a step closer. He tried on a smile. "It was a terrible broken thing. We'll get things cleaned up. We'll wait for the spring thaw. Just you and me, son. Son." He reached out a hand to me. It was trembling. I could see the faint, rusty brown crescent of my mother's blood under his fingernails. The warmth of the other Ignacio, the caretaker, was a distant echo now, a fading ember in the vast cold of the hotel. But his words came back to me. "It wears you like a suit of clothes." This was the final fitting. I did not take his hand. I slowly stood up from the chair. The movement felt stiff, not entirely my own. I looked not at my father's eyes, but at a point on the wall just behind his head, a place where the garish wallpaper pattern swirled into a shape that looked like a screaming face. "Okay, Dad," I heard myself say. The voice was flat, compliant. The relief that washed over his face was a profound and horrible thing. It was the relief of a man who has been pardoned, not knowing the pardon itself is the sentence. The thing inside him relaxed its grip, just for a moment, confident in its victory. In that moment, I turned and I ran. I did not run for the outside. That was a hope that had been extinguished. I ran for the heart of the hotel. I ran for the ballroom. I heard a roar behind me, a sound of tearing fabric and splintering wood that was not human. The thing was giving up the pretense. The footsteps that followed me were not the thump of my father's work boots, but a heavier, multi-legged scrabbling, like a great insect made of shadow and rage. I burst through the double doors into the grand ballroom. It was not empty. The air was thick with the ghosts of the party. A shimmering, silent crowd in their fine clothes. They turned as one, their faces indistinct smears of light, and raised their crystal glasses in a soundless toast. The chandeliers overhead blazed with a cold electric fire. I ran to the center of the vast empty dance floor, my socks slipping on the polished wood. I stopped and turned. He filled the doorway. It was my father's shape, but it was bloated and distorted, stretching to fit the frame. The darkness was in his eyes now, pouring out like smoke. There is no out, the chorus of voices hissed. The sound slithering across the ballroom. There is only in. I closed my eyes. I stopped fighting the pressure. The temperature changes, the tastes. I stopped being a radio receiver. I became a transmitter. I thought of my mother's hand, cold on my shoulder. I thought of the little boy in the drain pipe, his voice thin with terror. I thought of the warm Ignacio's sad, kind eyes. I gathered every feeling, every memory of love and fear and loss that this place had tried to steal from me. And I pushed it all out. I opened my eyes, and I looked directly into the swirling darkness of my father's face. "You are not welcome here," I said, and my voice did not sound like my own. It was clear, strong, and it echoed in the vast room. A real sound in a place of echoes. The thing inside my father recoiled. The phantom crowd in the ballroom flickered, their glasses shaking in their hands. A crack appeared in the parquet floor at my feet, a thin, black line that snaked towards the doorway. With a final shrieking wail of rage that seemed to tear the very air, the darkness ripped itself free from my father's body. It was a cloud of black smoke, of buzzing flies, of forgotten words. It shot up towards the ceiling, swirling around the chandeliers, and then, with a sound like a great intake of breath, it was gone. My father collapsed. He was just a man, lying small and broken on the floor. The ballroom was empty, truly empty. The chandeliers were dark. The only light came from the lobby, a sickly yellow glow. I walked over to my father. I knelt beside him. He was breathing, shallow little puffs of air that misted in the cold. He was just a man, and he was alone, and so was I. I stood up. I left him there. I walked out of the ballroom, through the lobby, past the spot where my mother had fallen. I did not look at her. I could not. I went outside. The snow had stopped. The moon was out, a sliver of bone in a black sky. The world was silent. The hedge animals were just shrubs again, buried under the snow. The hotel stood behind me, a great dark mountain against the night. It was quiet. It was just a building. I started walking. I did not know where the road was. I did not know if I would live through the night. The cold was a certainty now, a fact as simple as breathing. But with every step I took away from the overlook, the pressure behind my eyes lessened. The taste in my throat began to fade. I was leaving the symphony of forgotten moments behind. I was just a boy, walking in the snow, under a cold, uncaring moon. And for the first time in a long time, the silence was just silence. It was not watching. It was not hungry. It was nothing at all. The moon was a weak guide, its light absorbed by the endless, featureless white. My snowsuit was no longer a protection but a damp, frozen shroud. Each step was a monumental effort, sinking me knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, into the drift. The cold was no longer an external force. It had become the core of my being, a crystalline structure growing inside my chest. I did not think of my father left alone on the ballroom floor. I did not think of my mother lying still in the basement. I thought only of the next step, and the next. The hotel was a dark tooth on the mountain behind me, but I refused to look back. To look back was to acknowledge its presence, and that might be enough to call it forth again. I walked for an hour, or maybe a lifetime. The world was a void of white and black, soundless except for the crunch of my own movement and the ragged saw of my breath. My legs grew numb, then heavy, then distant, as if they belonged to someone else. A part of me, the part that was still a boy, wanted to lie down, to close my eyes. The snow looked soft. It promised sleep. Then I saw it. A flicker of orange in the vast, monochrome world. A light. It was far down the slope, maybe a mile, maybe 10. It was steady. It was real. I tried to run, but my body would not obey. I could only slog forward, a slow, plodding puppet with frozen strings. The light grew no larger, but it grew brighter, a pinprick of defiance against the immense dark. A new sound entered the silence, a low mechanical thrum. It was faint, but it vibrated in the ice under my feet. A snowplow. It had to be. Hope is a dangerous thing. It thaws the frozen parts of you, and the pain that comes with that thawing is exquisite. I felt a sob tear its way out of my throat, a raw, painful thing. I waved my arms, a clumsy, pathetic semaphore against the endless white. They couldn't possibly see me. The thrumming grew louder. The orange light resolved into 2 headlights, carving a path through the snow. They were not on the buried road. They were coming up the mountain straight toward me. I collapsed. My legs simply gave out. I lay in the snow, watching the lights bob and weave as the vehicle pushed through the drifts. It was a tracked snowcat, painted Park Service green. It crunched to a halt, a dozen yards away. A door opened, and a figure climbed out, silhouetted against the headlights. He was bulky in a parka, his face hidden by a fur-lined hood. He crunched over to me, his boots making solid, real sounds. He knelt, pushing back his hood. He had a kind, weathered face, etched with lines from squinting into sun and snow. His eyes were the color of the sky just before a storm. "Good God, son," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Why in the hell are you doing out here?" He saw the state of me, the frozen tears on my face, the hollow look in my eyes that had nothing to do with the cold. He didn't ask any more questions. He simply put his arms under me and lifted me as if I weighed nothing. He carried me to the snowcat and bundled me into the passenger seat, blasting the heater until it scorched the air. As we turned and began the slow, lurching descent, I finally looked back. The Overlook Hotel was just a shape, a darker patch of night against the mountain. It looked small. It looked empty. The man was silent for a long time, his focus on navigating the treacherous slope. Then he spoke, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. "That place," he said, almost to himself. "We got a call. A garbled radio message from a trucker down on the pass. Said he saw a light up here. A strange light. Nobody's supposed to be up here until May." Nobody's supposed to be up here until May." He glanced at me, his gaze sharp and knowing. "My name's Bill. My grandfather was the first winter caretaker they ever hired for the Overlook. He didn't last the season." I looked at him, a new kind of cold seeping into my soul. Bill nodded, as if I had spoken. "Yeah," he said. "It's a bad place. We in the valley, we've always known. We just don't talk about it." He reached over and turned up the heater, the fan roaring like a distant waterfall. "You don't have to talk about it either, son. Not unless you want to." I turned away from the window and looked at my hands, thawing now in the artificial heat. They were red and raw. They were just hands. I was just a boy. The snowcat pushed on, down the mountain, toward the world of lights and people and noise. Away from the silence, away from the hungry thought. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I did not dream of rocket ship quilts or the sound of a baseball game. I dreamed of nothing at all, and it was a comfort. The road crew found my father 2 days later, wandering in his undershirt along the shoulder of the highway, half frozen and babbling about a party that had gotten out of hand. They took him to the same county hospital where I was being treated for severe frostbite and exposure. We were put in separate rooms. A woman with a kind, tired face from social services came to see me. She asked me questions I didn't have the words to answer. They told me my father was suffering from acute psychosis, exacerbated by isolation and the trauma of my mother's accidental death. They said he had constructed a complex narrative to cope. They said a lot of things. I just nodded. It was easier. He was transferred to a facility in Boulder. Before he left, he asked to see me. I stood in the doorway of his room. He was sitting in a chair by the window, looking small in his hospital gown. He looked old. "Brant," he said, and his voice was a whisper. "The things I saw, the things I think I did. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Your mother." He began to cry, slow, quiet tears that tracked through the stubble on his cheeks. She fell. I know she fell. But I remember swinging. He looked at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "Did I swing, Brant?" I looked at him, at the genuine, gut-wrenching confusion and horror on his face. The hotel was gone from him. It had left its wreckage behind, but it was gone. It had used him up and spat him out. He was just a broken man, haunted by echoes he could never understand. "I don't know, Dad," I said. It was the truth. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't know if the mallet was real, or if the floor was just slippery with condensation. All I knew was the sound it made. I turned and walked away, down the bright, sterile hallway. The social worker was waiting for me. She said I would be going to live with my aunt in Portland. She said it would be a new start. They gave me a small box of my things from the hotel. Someone had gone up and retrieved them before the snows sealed the mountain pass again until spring. There wasn't much. Some clothes. A book. And at the bottom of the box, nestled in a sweater, was the old leather-bound ledger from the front desk. I don't know why I took it. I had no memory of packing it. In my aunt's quiet house, in the room that was to be mine, I opened it. The pages were brittle and yellowed. I flipped past the old reservations, the faded ink. I stopped on a page near the back. The writing was different from the rest. It was a single sentence, scrawled in a frantic, desperate hand, the ink a rusty brown. I knew that shade. I had seen it under my father's nails. It read, "I am becoming the caretaker. The thought is becoming flesh." I closed the book. I didn't throw it away. I put it on a high shelf in the closet. Some truths are too terrible to hold, but too important to destroy. The Overlook was just a building again, silent under the snow. But a building can be reopened. A thought can be thought again. And somewhere, in the quiet of a new house, in the rhythm of a new life, I sometimes feel a familiar pressure, a fleeting taste of rotten honey on my tongue. It's just a memory. It has to be. I close my eyes, and I wait for it to pass. The new school was a low, modern building, all glass and pale brick, a world away from the echoing corridors of the Overlook. The kids were different, too. Their voices were loud and unafraid, their concerns mundane and immediate. I was the quiet boy from Colorado, the one whose parents had died in some weird accident at a hotel. They left me alone for the most part. My aunt tried her best. She made meatloaf on Tuesdays and asked me about my day in a soft, careful voice. I gave her the answers she wanted to hear. At night, I would lie in my bed and listen to the sounds of the city. A siren in the distance, the hum of a neighbor's television. They were human noises, the sounds of life continuing. I would focus on them, using them as an anchor to keep my mind from drifting back to that other silence, the one that listened back. One Saturday, my aunt asked me to clean out the closet. I was pulling down a box of old winter coats when the ledger tumbled from the top shelf and fell to the floor. It landed with a soft thud, splayed open to a page I had never seen before. The paper was thicker, older. The writing was an ornate, looping cursive. July 4th, 1921. It began. The grand opening. Such a splendid party. Mr. Darby, the financier, was in such high spirits. He spoke of the hotel's bright future. He did not see the look in his wife's eyes when he danced with the young actress from New York. Later in the West Wing suite, their argument was most severe. The sound of the blow, a silver hairbrush against a temple, was surprisingly dull. We have placed them in the basement, behind the old furnace. It is for now a convenient arrangement. No one will think to look for them here. The hotel is pleased. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just a story. A horrible, fictional story written by some long-dead clerk with a sick imagination. It had to be, but I could feel it. A subtle shift in the air of my quiet, safe bedroom. A faint, sweet smell of decay, like flowers left too long in a vase. I shoved the ledger deep into a garbage bag full of old clothes, knotting the top tightly. I took it out to the bin behind the garage. That was that. It was over. But it wasn't. A few days later, watching the evening news with my aunt, a story came on. A real estate conglomerate had purchased the Overlook Hotel. They were planning a massive renovation to reopen it as a luxury year-round resort. The segment showed old black and white photos of the hotel in its heyday, followed by a slick computer-generated rendering of its proposed future. The anchor smiled, talking about restoring a landmark. I felt the world tilt. The taste of rotten honey flooded my mouth, so strong I gagged. The pressure behind my eyes returned, a dull, familiar ache. My aunt looked over, her face creased with concern. "Brant, are you all right, honey? You're white as a sheet." I couldn't answer. I was staring at the television screen, at the artist's rendering of the gleaming, revitalized Overlook. In the reflection on the screen, just for a second, I saw a figure standing behind my chair. It was not my father. It was a man in a white suit, his face a smudge of shadow, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. I blinked and he was gone. The news had moved on to a sports report. I got up, mumbling something about homework, and went to my room. I stood at the window, looking out at the neat green lawns and the quiet street. It was all a lie. A clean, white lie. The silence wasn't just silence. It was waiting. It was always waiting. And now, someone was going to open the door and invite it back in. The thought was becoming flesh all over again. And this time, it knew my name. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.